When millionaire cattle baron Grant McAllister rode through a Wyoming blizzard in 1884 to find his childhood home burned to ashes, he thought he'd lost everything. But what he discovered in a widow's cabin on Ridge Creek would shatter every belief he'd built his empire on. The woman feeding his parents from her last supplies would teach him that wealth means nothing without conscience, and that sometimes the poorest soul holds the richest heart. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The first thing Grant McAllister noticed when he crested the ridge above Cold Creek Valley was the silence. In Wyoming's winter of 1884, silence meant death, of livestock, of hope, of men who thought they could outlast a blizzard. He'd ridden 3 days through waist-deep snow, his black stallion's breath coming in frozen plumes, following a trail that grew colder with each mile. The telegram had been brief, the kind that stripped away all pretense. Fire. Your parents. Come now. Grant was a man who measured his life in acres and assets. At 32, he owned more land than most men could ride across in a week, commanded crews of cowboys who moved cattle like armies across the territory, and wore custom boots from San Francisco beneath trousers that cost more than a homesteader's monthly wages. People called him King McAllister behind his back, though never to his face. Kings didn't need to hear their titles spoken aloud. But now, as his horse picked through the snowdrifts toward the place where he'd been born, Grant felt every ounce of that kingdom weigh on him like chains. The cabin, or what remained of it, emerged from the white landscape like a broken tooth. Blackened timbers jutted at violent angles from the snow, and the stone chimney his father had built 40 years ago stood alone, a tombstone marking the death of something irretrievable. Smoke still rose in thin ribbons from the ruins, though the fire must have burned days ago. The wind carried the acrid smell of destruction, mixing with the clean bite of winter pine. Grant dismounted before his horse fully stopped, boots hitting the snow with a crunch that echoed too loudly in the stillness. "Ma!" His voice cracked on the word, rusty from disuse and fear. "Pa!" Nothing answered but the wind. He staggered forward, his expensive boots sinking deep, reaching the threshold where the door had once hung. The snow around the ruins was trampled, disturbed by boots and what might have been a struggle. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed into the wreckage, scanning for bodies, for signs, for anything that would tell him whether he was a son or an orphan. "They ain't here!" Grant spun, hand instinctively dropping to the colt at his hip. A figure materialized from the smoke-hazed tree line. Old Ephraim Tate, their nearest neighbor, lantern raised high despite the afternoon light. The old man's face was carved from weather and hard living, every line a story of survival. "Ephraim." Grant's throat worked around the name. "Where?" "Alive," Ephraim said, and Grant's knees nearly buckled. "Both of 'em. Widow Hayes pulled 'em out before the roof caved. Got 'em up at her place on Ridge Creek." Relief hit Grant like a physical blow, followed immediately by a wave of shame so intense it nauseated him. He'd built an empire. He'd turned a modest ranch into a cattle dynasty that stretched across 3 counties. He'd dined with railroad men and politicians, had been photographed for newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver. And yet he'd left his parents, the people who'd given him life, who'd worked themselves to bone teaching him to read and ride and reckon, alone in a cabin that could burn while he sat in his mansion planning his next acquisition. "Ridge Creek," Grant repeated, his voice hollow. "The Hayes place?" Ephraim's expression was unreadable in the fading light, but Grant caught something that might have been disapproval. "Nora Hayes, widow 2 years now, lives alone up there, scratching by on not much more than pride and stubbornness." He paused, then added with deliberate weight, "She gave your folks her own bed. Been feeding 'em from stores that were meant to last her through spring." The shame deepened, became something physical lodged in Grant's chest. He looked back at the ruins of his childhood home, at the place where his mother had taught him to read from a Bible by candlelight, where his father had shown him how to mend tack and gentle horses. 3 months. It had been 3 months since he'd made the ride out from his ranch to visit. 3 months of telling himself he was too busy, that spring would be better, that they understood. "How'd it start?" Grant asked. Ephraim's jaw tightened. "Can't say for certain. Your pa thinks it was the lamp, knocked over when he was feeling poorly. But he trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the valley below where other homesteads dotted the landscape like scattered stones. But what? There's been other fires, small ranchers mostly, always in winter when folks are most desperate. Ephraim's voice dropped. Always followed by offers to buy the land cheap. Your company's made 3 such purchases in the last year. Grant's blood went cold. What are you saying? I ain't saying nothing that needs saying, boy. I'm just telling you what folks talk about. Ephraim adjusted his grip on the lantern. Widow Hayes is about a mile up the creek. Follow the ridgeline. You'll see her light. He turned to go, then paused. Grant? She didn't ask for payment, didn't expect thanks. She did it because it was right. The words hung in the cold air like an indictment. Might want to think on that. Then he was gone, swallowed by the gathering dusk, leaving Grant alone with the ruins and his conscience. The ride to Ridge Creek took longer than it should have. Grant's horse was exhausted, and the trail was treacherous in the failing light, but that wasn't why he moved slowly. With each step, the weight of understanding grew heavier. If Ephraim was right, if fires were being set to drive out homesteaders, then Grant's empire was built on more than cattle and ambition. It was built on fear and ash. He'd hired men to manage his operations, trusted them to expand his holdings through fair negotiation. But trust, he was beginning to understand, was just another word for willful ignorance when you didn't want to know the truth. The widow's cabin appeared as Ephraim had promised, a single point of light against the darkening mountain. It was small, barely more than 1 room with a lean-to stable, the kind of place that spoke of hard living and harder choices. But smoke rose steady from the chimney, and through the single window Grant could see movement, shadows cast by firelight. He dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, noticing the neat stack of firewood, the careful repairs to the steps, the sense of pride maintained despite obvious poverty. Through the window he saw them, his mother, Hannah McAllister, laughing, actually laughing, at something being said. His father, Daniel, propped against pillows in a chair near the fire, alive and animated in a way Grant hadn't seen in years. And the woman. She moved with efficient grace, ladling something from a pot into wooden bowls. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original cloth, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid. When she smiled at something Hannah said, the expression transformed her entire face, revealing beauty that had nothing to do with youth or ornament and everything to do with the quality of light in her eyes. Grant raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the window, he watched his mother reach out to touch the widow's arm, saw the easy affection between them, the kind of comfort that comes from shared hardship. He was an intruder here, arriving with his expensive coat and his guilt, ready to rescue people who had already been saved by someone infinitely better than him. He knocked anyway. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened, bringing with it a wave of warmth and the smell of stew. The widow stood in the threshold, and her eyes, gray as smoke, sharp as winter light, swept over him in assessment. "You're late, Mr. McAllister," she said. Her voice was steady, neither warm nor cold, just stating a fact. From inside, his father's voice, rough but strong. 3 months too late. The words hit like a fist. Grant opened his mouth, found no defense worth offering, and closed it again. The widow studied him for another moment, then stepped back. "You'd better come in," she said. "Your horse looks done for, and so do you." Hassan. The cabin's interior was smaller than it had appeared from outside, made smaller still by the presence of 4 people and the weight of unspoken judgments. The single room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom, with a curtained alcove in the corner that must have been where the widow slept, or had slept, before she gave up her bed to his parents. Hannah McAllister rose from her seat near the fire, and Grant's breath caught. She looked older, more frail than when he'd last seen her, her gray hair thinner, her hands twisted with arthritis, but her eyes were bright, and when she opened her arms, he went to her like a child. "My boy," she murmured against his chest. "You came." "I'm sorry, Ma. I'm so sorry." She patted his back with those gnarled hands. "Sorry's just words, Grant, but you're here now. That's what matters." His father made a sound, half grunt, half dismissal. Daniel McAllister had been a hard man when Grant was young, harder still after a logging accident took his left hand 20 years ago. He'd taught Grant that sentiment was weakness, that land and livestock were what mattered, that a man measured his worth by what he could build and defend. Looking at him now, wrapped in borrowed quilts in a stranger's home, Grant saw the fallacy of that philosophy laid bare. "Pa," Grant said, moving to kneel beside the chair, "thank God you're—" "Don't." Daniel's remaining hand gripped the chair arm. "Don't thank God. Thank her." He jerked his chin toward the widow, who had returned to the stove, her back diplomatically turned. "She's the one who ran into a burning building. She's the one who's been sharing food she can't spare. Medicine she needs herself. Thank her." Grant stood slowly, turned to face the woman who'd saved his parents' lives. She was stirring the pot again, her movements careful and economical. When she finally looked at him, her expression was guarded. "Mrs. Hayes." "Says," Grant began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. How did you thank someone for something you could never repay? How did you apologize for wealth that suddenly felt obscene in the face of this woman's poverty and grace? "It's just Nora," she said. "Mrs. Hayes was my mother-in-law, and she never much liked me anyway." She lifted the spoon, tested the stew, added salt from a diminishing tin. "You'll be wanting supper. There's enough if we're careful with portions." "I can pay," Grant said quickly, "for food, for their care, for—" "No." The word was flat, final. Nora set down the spoon and turned to face him fully. "I didn't pull your parents from that fire for money, Mr. McAllister. I didn't feed them or tend them or give up my bed expecting payment. I did it because it was right, because they needed help and I could give it." Her gray eyes held his without wavering. "Decency isn't for sale." The rebuke was delivered quietly, but it landed with the force of a shouted accusation. Grant felt his face heat despite the cold still clinging to his clothes. "I didn't mean to insult you," he said. I want to help." "Then sit down and eat without turning it into a transaction." Nora moved to the table, began setting out bowls. "Your mother's been worried sick. Best thing you can do is let her see you're well." Grant did as he was told, settling onto a rough-hewn bench across from his father. Hannah shuffled to join them, moving slowly, and Grant noticed the tremor in her hands as she reached for her bowl. When had she gotten so fragile? The stew was thin, more broth than substance, with a few vegetables and what might have been rabbit stretched impossibly far. But it was hot and seasoned with care, and Grant watched his parents eat with an appreciation that suggested they'd known real hunger recently. Nora ate last and least, taking only a small portion and focusing on the bread instead. Grant noticed but said nothing, understanding that his notice would be unwelcome. "The house," Hannah said softly, breaking the silence. "Did you see? It's gone, Ma, all of it." Grant forced himself to meet her eyes. "But we'll rebuild. I'll have a crew out here next week, something better, something fire-safe." Daniel snorted. "With whose money? Yours?" He shook his head. "We don't want your charity, boy. We're not some homesteaders you can buy off with a new barn. Pa, You're trying to fix with money what you broke by neglect." Daniel's voice was steady, merciless. 3 months, Grant. The last letter we sent was September, asking if you could spare a few head of cattle for winter stores. We got no answer. I never received—" Grant stopped, his stomach sinking. He received hundreds of letters at his ranch, sorted by his secretary, prioritized by importance. Had his own parents' request been dismissed as insignificant, filed away under minor correspondence? "Doesn't matter now," Hannah said, always the peacemaker. "You're here. We're alive. Nora's been an angel." "I'm no angel." Nora stood, began collecting the empty bowls. "Angels don't have creditors knocking. Angels don't lie awake wondering how to make winter stores stretch to spring." The bitterness in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Grant watched her move to the wash basin, her shoulders straight despite exhaustion he could see in every movement. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been caring for them?" 3 days since the fire," Nora said without turning. "They were at the Tate place the first night, but Ephraim's got 8 children and a wife with consumption. No room, really, so I brought them here. 3 days. 3 days of this woman sharing everything she had with strangers because it was right. Grant thought of his mansion, of the unused bedrooms, the pantry stocked with more food than he could eat in a year. The contrast was obscene. "Then I'm staying," he announced. "I'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses. I can help. Chop wood, tend stock, whatever needs doing." Nora's hands stilled in the wash basin. She turned slowly, water dripping from her fingers. "This isn't a hotel, Mr. McAllister, and I don't need your charity any more than your parents need yours." "It's not charity." Grant stood, hat in hands. "It's the least I can do. You said decency isn't for sale. Well, maybe it can be returned. Maybe I can learn something about it." For a long moment, Nora studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, Hannah laughed, a dry, crackling sound. "Let him stay, dear. It'll do him good to remember what work looks like." She smiled at her son with affection tempered by disapproval. "Your father and I raised a cowboy. Somewhere under all that fine tailoring, there might still be one." Daniel grunted what might have been agreement. Nora looked between them, then back at Grant, and finally nodded once, sharply. "Fine. Lean-to's got room if you don't mind the smell of horse. But I expect work, Mr. McAllister. Real work. Not the kind where you tell other men what to do." "Grant," he said. "Just Grant." "Fine. Grant." She turned back to her dishes. "There's an axe outside. Woodpile's low. If you're staying, you'd better make yourself useful before it's too dark to see." Grant found the axe leaning against the side of the cabin, its blade worn but well maintained. The woodpile was indeed low, barely enough for another day, let alone the weeks of winter that remained. He shed his expensive coat, rolled up his sleeves despite the cold, and set to work. The first swing went wide, the blade biting into the chopping block instead of the log. Grant swore, adjusted his grip, tried again. This time he connected, but the split was uneven, the log toppling sideways. Behind him, he heard the cabin door open and close. He didn't look, focusing instead on setting up another log, on remembering the rhythm his father had taught him decades ago. Feet apart, balanced, eye on the target, follow through. The next swing was better, and the next. Soon he found the old pattern, the meditative quality of repetitive work. Swing, split, stack, swing, split, stack. His shoulders began to burn, then his back. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the freezing air. He didn't notice Nora until she spoke. "You're going to hurt yourself swinging like that." Grant looked up, breathing hard. She stood a few feet away, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, watching him with critical assessment. "I'm managing," he said. "You're compensating, favoring your left side." She moved closer, and Grant caught the scent of wood smoke and something herbal. Sage, maybe, or mint. "Old injury? Bull gored me last spring, cracked some ribs." He set up another log, tried to hide the wince as he raised the axe. Nora reached out and stilled his hands. Her fingers were rough with calluses, stronger than they looked. "Stop. You'll split yourself open before you split enough wood to matter." "I can work through it." Pride before practicality. Must be a family trait. She took the axe from his hands, not roughly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Watch." She positioned herself at the block, feet planted wide, and swung. The axe descended in a perfect arc, splitting the log cleanly. She worked through 3 more in the time it had taken Grant to do one, each movement economical and precise. "It's not about strength," she said, handing back the axe. "It's about understanding the wood. See this one?" She pointed to a log with a visible crack. "Split's already started. Work with it, not against it. And this one, another log, this one gnarled with knots. You'll waste energy on that. Set it aside for kindling later." Grant took the axe back, their fingers briefly touching. He tried again, following her guidance, and felt the difference immediately. They worked in silence for a while, Nora stacking what he split, correcting his form with brief comments. The sun sank lower, painting the snow amber and rose, and the temperature dropped further. Grant's hands were raw, his shoulders screaming, but he kept working. This was penance. This was understanding. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked finally, pausing to catch his breath. "After your husband died. Why stay out here alone?" Nora was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, Where else would I go? Town, family, somewhere easier. Family? She laughed without humor. My people are in Missouri. Didn't approve of Thomas. He was a dreamer, they said. Impractical. When we came west, they told me not to come crawling back when it failed. She picked up another split log, added it to the stack. And it did fail in a way. Thomas died trying to build something from nothing, but I'm still here, still building. That's not failure. That's stubbornness. It's courage, Grant said. No. Nora turned to face him fully, and in the fading light, her features were softened, made beautiful by shadow. Courage is having a choice and making the hard one. I had no choice. This is just survival. You had a choice 3 days ago. You could have let Ephraim deal with my parents, could have said it wasn't your problem. Your parents are good people. They didn't deserve to die because their son was too busy counting his fortune to visit. The words were harsh, but delivered without particular heat, as if stating a simple fact. Besides, your mother reminds me of mine. Same hands, same way of humming while she works. I couldn't... She trailed off, then shook her head. Doesn't matter. It's done. Grant wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he had no defense. Everything she said was true. I'll do better, he said quietly. I'll be better. Nora met his eyes, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded once and turned back toward the cabin. Finish the woodpile. There's soap and water in the lean-to for washing up. Supper's in an hour. She was gone before Grant could respond, leaving him alone with the axe and his thoughts, and the growing understanding that he'd been living wrong for a very long time. That night, Grant lay in the lean-to on a bed of hay, listening to the horses breathe and the wind test the walls. His hands were blistered, his back a solid ache, and he'd never felt more exhausted in his life. At his ranch, he had a 4-poster bed with goose-down mattresses. Here, he had hay and horse smell and cold that seeped through every crack. He'd never slept better. Through the thin wall, he could hear low voices, Nora reading to his parents from what sounded like scripture. Her voice was steady, melodic, the words familiar and comforting. Grant's mother had read to him the same way once, before he'd grown too important for such simple pleasures. He thought about the telegram sitting in his saddlebag, the one from his foreman reporting record prices for the spring cattle drive. He thought about his accounts in Cheyenne, growing fatter while his parents nearly burned to death. He thought about Ephraim's insinuations about fires and land purchases. Tomorrow, he would ask questions. Tomorrow, he would face uncomfortable truths. But tonight, he let himself simply be a son, grateful that his parents lived, and humbled by the widow who'd taught him that wealth had nothing to do with money. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song, and snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. The storm was coming. Grant pulled the horse blanket tighter and listened to Nora's voice reading about mercy and justice, about camels and needles and kingdoms that meant nothing in the face of love. For the first time in years, he prayed, not for success or profit, but for understanding, for the chance to become someone worthy of the grace he'd been shown. The snow fell. The fire burned low. And in a widow's cabin on Ridge Creek, 4 people who should have been strangers became something else entirely. Something like family. Something like home. Morning came gray and bitter cold. Grant woke to his father's voice calling his name, urgent and strained. He bolted from the hay, pulled on his boots, and stumbled into the cabin to find Daniel doubled over in his chair, face pale, breathing labored. "Pa!" Grant rushed to his side. "It's his heart," Hannah said, her voice tight with fear. "It does this sometimes." "Since the fire." "The smoke." "I'm fine," Daniel gasped, but his grip on the chair arm told another story. Nora was already moving, pulling down jars from a shelf, mixing something with practiced efficiency. "Grant, get him flat." "Hannah, warm water. Now." They moved like a team, Grant lifting his father as gently as possible while Nora prepared what looked like a tea mixture. She brought it to Daniel's lips, supporting his head with surprising strength. "Drink," she ordered. "All of it. Don't argue." Daniel drank, and gradually, agonizingly, his breathing eased. Color returned to his face. The crisis passed, leaving everyone shaken. "What was that?" Grant asked, watching Nora return the jars to the shelf. "Hawthorn mostly. Some valerian for calm." She didn't look at him. He needs a doctor, real medicine. But I don't have money for town doctors, and I doubt they'd come out here in this weather anyway. I'll get him a doctor. You'll what? Nora spun on him, and for the first time he saw real anger in her eyes. Ride 3 days to Cheyenne in a blizzard? Drag some town doctor back here to charge money neither your parents nor I have? Your father needs rest and care and time to heal, not your grand gestures. He's my father. Then act like his son instead of his banker. The words cracked like a whip. You want to help? Stay. Be present. Learn that some things can't be fixed with money thrown at them from a distance. The cabin fell silent, except for Daniel's labored breathing. Hannah looked between them, her expression pained. Grant felt the truth of Nora's words like stones in his chest. You're right, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Nora held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once and turned away. Storm's getting worse. We're snowed in for at least a few days. Might as well make ourselves useful. And so the days began. Days that would change everything Grant thought he knew about himself, about wealth, about what mattered. Days of learning humility by the fire a widow kept alive, learning grace from people who had nothing but gave everything, learning that sometimes the richest man is the one who understands exactly how poor he's been. Outside, the blizzard howled and buried the world in white. Inside, in a cabin barely big enough for 4, a millionaire began the slow, painful work of becoming human again. The fire crackled, the snow fell, and Grant McAllister, who'd spent his life building an empire, started learning how to build a home. The blizzard lasted 5 days. 5 days of snow falling so thick the world beyond the cabin windows became nothing but white static, erasing boundaries between earth and sky. 5 days of wind that howled through the pines like something living and hungry, rattling the shutters and seeking every crack in the walls. 5 days where the 4 people trapped inside learned that proximity doesn't guarantee intimacy. But sometimes, if you're desperate or lucky or both, it forces a kind of truth that distance makes easy to avoid. Grant spent the first morning chopping wood until his hands bled. He worked without gloves, punishing himself with the cold and the pain, splitting logs with a fury born of shame and something deeper he couldn't name. When Nora finally came outside and saw the blood on the axe handle, she didn't say a word. She simply took his hands, led him inside, and cleaned the wounds with water so hot it made him gasp. Martyrdom doesn't impress me, she said, wrapping his palms in strips of cloth torn from what looked like an old petticoat. And it doesn't help anyone. Work smart, not angry. I wasn't angry, Grant protested. Nora's gray eyes met his, and he saw she understood far more than he'd said. Then what were you? He couldn't answer. Didn't know how to explain the turbulence inside him, guilt and grief, and the growing awareness that he'd built his entire life on a foundation of sand. So he said nothing, and after a moment Nora nodded as if his silence had confirmed something. Your father needs his dressing changed, she said. Burns on his arm from the fire. I've been using honey and yarrow, but it's not healing right. Maybe you could help. It wasn't a request. Grant followed her to where Daniel sat by the fire, his shirt rolled up to reveal an angry wound that stretched from wrist to elbow. The old man's jaw was clenched against pain he refused to acknowledge. Don't need fussing, Daniel muttered, but his voice lacked its usual force. Then consider it punishment for your stubbornness, Nora said, her tone light but her movements gentle as she peeled away the old bandage. The wound beneath was red and weeping. Grant, hold his arm steady. This will hurt. Grant knelt beside his father's chair and took the scarred forearm in his bandaged hands. Daniel's skin was hot, the muscles beneath tense. When Nora began cleaning the burn with what smelled like sage tea, the old man's breath hissed between his teeth, but he made no other sound. Pa, Grant said quietly, watching Nora work with practiced efficiency. I need to ask you something. Then ask. The fire. You really think it was the lamp? Daniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. Your mother thinks so. But you don't. I think, Daniel winced as Nora applied fresh honey, I think there's been a lot of fires lately. I think small ranchers keep getting offers to sell right after their barns burn or their fences get cut. I think there's money to be made in other people's misfortune. Grant's hands tightened on his father's arm. My company, your company, Daniel interrupted, is run by men you hired and then forgot about. Men who report numbers, not methods. When's the last time you asked how a piece of land was acquired, Grant? When's the last time you looked at a contract and asked why someone would sell so cheap? The words landed like physical blows. Grant wanted to defend himself, to insist he'd always acted honorably, but the defense died in his throat. Because his father was right. He'd hired managers to handle acquisitions, had reviewed only the final numbers, had concerned himself with profit margins and stock counts, while deliberately remaining ignorant of the human cost. I didn't know, he said finally. No, Daniel agreed, his voice gentling slightly. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. Nora finished bandaging the wound and stood, gathering the soiled cloths. Burns need air to heal, but not cold. Keep him near the fire. She paused, looking between father and son. Whatever happened, happened. What matters is what you do now. She moved away to dispose of the bandages, leaving Grant kneeling beside his father's chair. Daniel's good hand came to rest on Grant's shoulder, heavy and warm. I don't hate you, boy, the old man said quietly, but I'm disappointed. You were supposed to be better than me. Instead, you just got richer. The words should have hurt. Instead, they felt like absolution, an acknowledgement that failure was possible, which meant redemption might be too. I want to fix this, Grant said. All of it. I just don't know how. Start by staying, Daniel said. Learn what it's like to have nothing but what you can carry. Might change your perspective on what matters. From across the room, Hannah's voice rose in a hymn, thin and wavering but pure. Nora joined her after a moment, harmonizing in a low alto that wrapped around the melody like smoke. Grant listened to them sing about valleys and shadows and fear transformed by faith, and something in his chest cracked open. The snow fell. The fire burned. And Grant McAllister began to understand that being rich and being whole were not the same thing at all. By the second day, cabin fever had set in. 4 people, 1 room, and nowhere to go made everything sharper. Voices, movements, the small irritations of shared space. Hannah fretted over Daniel's cough. Daniel snapped at Hannah's fretting. Nora moved between them with endless patience, though Grant noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened when Daniel complained about the food, or Hannah apologized for the 10th time about being a burden. I'm going to check the horses, Grant announced, needing escape, needing to breathe air that wasn't weighted with unspoken resentment. Take this, Nora said, handing him a bucket. Snow needs melting for water anyway. Outside, the cold hit like a fist, stealing his breath. The world was reduced to shades of white and gray, the lean-to barely visible through the driving snow. Grant pushed through drifts that reached his thighs, finally making it to the shelter where his black stallion and Nora's aging mare stood hip-shot and patient. Hey there, he murmured, running his hand along the stallion's neck. The horse nickered softly, his breath warm clouds in the frozen air. I know. I'm ready to leave too. But even as he said it, Grant realized it wasn't entirely true. Yes, the cabin was cramped and the tension exhausting. But there was something else too, something about the simplicity of life reduced to essential needs. Warmth, food, shelter, company. No accounts to review, no business decisions to agonize over, no performance to maintain. Just survival, shared honestly. He was filling the bucket with clean snow when he heard the lean-to door creak. Nora entered, wrapped in layers that made her look twice her actual size, carrying a feed sack. Didn't mean to crowd you out, she said, moving to pour oats into the horse's trough. You didn't. I just needed air. I know. She smiled slightly. Your mother means well, but she hovers, and your father's in pain, which makes him mean. It's exhausting even when they're not your parents. Grant watched her work, struck by her efficiency. Everything she did was deliberate, nothing wasted, not movement, not words, not resources. It was the economy of someone who'd learned that waste could mean death. How do you do it? He asked. Live like this, I mean. Alone. Nora was quiet for a moment, running her hand along the mare's flank. You make it sound like a choice, like I woke up one morning and decided poverty looked interesting. That's not what I meant. No? She turned to face him, and her expression was unreadable. What did you mean then? How does a woman survive when her husband dies and leaves her nothing but debt and a piece of land too poor to farm? How does she keep going when the bank wants payment and the townspeople whisper about how she's probably to blame for his death somehow, because women always are? The bitterness in her voice was new, raw, and bleeding. Grant took a step toward her. Nora, you want to know how I do it? She wasn't shouting, but her voice carried the weight of years compressed into words. I wake up every morning and I choose to keep breathing. I shoot rabbits and trap fish and trade eggs for flour when the chickens are laying. I mend my clothes until there's more thread than fabric. I burn pine needles because I can't afford proper tea, and I tell myself that tomorrow might be better, even when I know it probably won't be. Her eyes were bright now, though whether with tears or anger, Grant couldn't tell. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate or insulting. Thomas believed in this place, Nora continued, her voice softening. He said the land was good, that we just needed time and work to make it prosper. He died believing that. Believing in something I knew was a lie even then. She turned back to the mare, her hands gentle on the horse's neck. But I stay because leaving would mean his death was for nothing, and I can't let it be for nothing. Grant understood then. She wasn't talking about land or money or even survival. She was talking about meaning, about the human need to believe that suffering serves a purpose, that loss can be transformed into something that matters. I lost my wife, he heard himself say. The words came without permission, pulled from a place he'd kept locked for 5 years. Childbirth, the baby too, a son. Nora went very still. I built everything after that, Grant continued. Every acre, every head of cattle, every dollar. It was all to outrun the memory of holding her hand while she bled out. Too far from town, too far from help. I thought if I could just build something big enough, grand enough, it would fill the space they left behind. Did it? Nora asked quietly. No. The word was barely a whisper. It just gave me more distance from everything that mattered. They stood in silence, two people who'd lost everything, learning that sometimes the greatest luxury is simply being understood. Outside, the wind howled. The horses shifted and breathed. And for the first time since Catherine died, Grant let himself remember not just the loss, but the love that made the loss unbearable. Her name was Catherine, he said. She sang while she cooked, badly, completely off key. He smiled at the memory. Used to drive me crazy. Now I'd give everything I own to hear it one more time. Nora reached out and took his bandaged hand in hers. The gesture was brief, not romantic, but deeply human. One survivor acknowledging another. Come on, she said. Your mother will worry. They trudged back through the snow together, and when they entered the cabin, bringing cold air and melted snow, Hannah looked up from her mending with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. Thank goodness, she said. I was about to send your father after you, and he can barely stand. We were just tending the horses, Ma. I know, but storms like this... She trailed off, her hands trembling on the cloth. They take people. They take everything. Grant crossed to her and knelt, taking her gnarled hands in his. I'm here, Ma. I'm not going anywhere. Promise me, she said urgently, her eyes searching his face. Promise me you'll learn, that you'll be different, better. I promise. Hannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded and returned to her mending. Daniel, watching from his chair, said nothing, but something in his expression had softened. That night they played cards by firelight, a battered deck Nora produced from a trunk. The rules were simple, the stakes non-existent, but the laughter was real. Hannah won 3 hands in a row, crowing with delight each time, while Daniel accused her of cheating with such obvious pride that even he smiled. Grant lost spectacularly, his attention divided between the cards and Nora's face, watching the way firelight caught in her eyes when she laughed at his mistakes. You're terrible at this, she said, laying down yet another winning hand. Never had much time for games. Too busy making money, Daniel observed. Too busy making mistakes, Grant corrected, and his father's eyebrows rose in surprise. Later, when his parents had retired behind the curtain and the cabin had fallen quiet, Grant helped Nora clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, putting away cards and banking the fire for the night. She moved to the window, looking out at the darkness and snow. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "Even when it's trying to kill you, winter's beautiful." Grant joined her at the window. Their reflections looked back at them, ghostly in the glass, two figures standing close but not quite touching, both of them damaged, both of them learning. "Tell me about him," Grant said. "Your husband." Nora was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Thomas was kind, impractical but kind. He believed people were basically good, that hard work always paid off, that dreams could substitute for reality if you believed hard enough." She smiled sadly. "I loved him for it, even as I resented him for it. He left me alone here with nothing but those dreams." "You're angry at him." "I'm furious at him." The admission seemed to surprise her. "He died trying to move a boulder that didn't need moving, trying to clear a field that would never grow anything worth planting. He died for nothing, and he left me to survive the consequences of his optimism." "But you stay." "But I stay." She turned from the window to face him. "Because anger and love aren't opposites, Grant. They're just different ways of caring, and I'd rather be angry at someone I loved than feel nothing at all." The truth of it resonated in Grant's chest. How many years had he spent trying not to feel anything about Catherine's death? How much energy wasted on numbness when anger might have been more honest? "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For this. For them. For—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin, the storm, the strange intimacy of shared crisis. "For reminding me how to be human." Nora's expression softened. "You're welcome. Though I suspect you're giving me too much credit. Some lessons can only be taught by life itself." She moved to her makeshift bed near the stove, a thin pallet of blankets that looked pitifully inadequate. Grant thought of his goose-down mattress at the ranch, his Turkish rugs and velvet drapes, and felt sick with the waste of it all. "Nora," he said, "when this is over, when the storm passes, I want to help, really help. Not with money thrown from a distance, but I want to understand how to fix what I've broken." She regarded him steadily in the firelight. "Then tomorrow I'll show you something, a place I go when I need to remember why I stay, why any of this matters." "All right. Good night, Grant." "Good night." He retreated to the lean-to, to his bed of hay and horse breath, and lay awake listening to the storm. But for the first time in days, the sound wasn't frightening. It was just weather, powerful but neutral, neither malicious nor kind. And somehow that made it easier to bear. The third day dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep in drifts that reached the cabin's eaves, and the sky was a blue so intense it hurt to look at directly. Everything sparkled, every branch, every icicle, every surface touched by sun. "Today," Nora announced at breakfast, "we dig out, and then I want to show Grant something." Daniel looked up from his oatmeal. "In this cold? You'll both freeze. We'll bundle up. Besides, your son needs to see." She glanced at Grant. "Trust me." They spent the morning shoveling paths, to the lean-to, to the woodpile, to the small shed where Nora kept tools. The work was exhausting, the cold relentless, but Grant welcomed the physical labor. It gave his hands something to do, his mind something to focus on, besides the growing tangle of feelings he couldn't quite name. After lunch, Nora handed him a pair of snowshoes she'd constructed from bent willow and leather strips. They were crude but functional, and Grant strapped them on with fingers clumsy from cold. "Where are we going?" he asked. "You'll see." They set out into the white wilderness, following a trail only Nora could see. The snowshoes kept them from sinking, but the going was still hard, each step requiring deliberate effort. Grant's legs burned, his lungs ached from the frozen air, but he followed without complaint. After 20 minutes of steady climbing through the pines, they emerged into a small clearing. At the far end stood a simple wooden cross, barely visible beneath its burden of snow. Nora moved to it and began clearing the drift with her gloved hands, revealing carved letters. Thomas Hayes, beloved husband, 1850 to 1882. Grant stood silent, understanding flooding through him. This was Nora's private grief, her secret place, and she was sharing it with him. "I come here when I'm angry," she said, still kneeling. "When I'm sad. When I'm so tired I think I can't go on. I come here and I tell him everything, how hard it is, how much I hate what he left me with, how much I miss him anyway." "And does it help?" "Sometimes." She stood, brushing snow from her skirts. "Sometimes it just reminds me that life continues whether we're ready or not, that we can't bury ourselves with the people we've lost, no matter how much we might want to." Grant moved to stand beside her, looking down at the grave. "I never visited Catherine's grave after the funeral, couldn't face it, couldn't bear to see her reduced to stone and dirt." "Where is she buried?" "Cheyenne, City Cemetery. I paid for an expensive monument, fresh flowers every week, made sure she was never forgotten." He laughed bitterly. "Easier to pay someone else to remember than to remember myself." Nora was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what Thomas would say if he knew I came here to complain? He'd laugh. He'd say grief is just love with nowhere to go, and that I should stop wasting time being angry when I could be living." She looked up at Grant. He was infuriating that way, always right about the things that mattered. "Do you want to live?" Grant asked. "Really live, not just survive?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Nora's breath came in small clouds as she considered her answer. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I do. I'm just not sure I remember how." "Then maybe we can learn together." Something shifted in Nora's expression, not quite a smile but a softening, an acknowledgement of possibility. She reached out and took his hand, and they stood there in the clearing while the sun tracked across the perfect blue sky and the forest held its breath around them. "Come on," she said eventually. "We should head back before dark. Your mother will fret." They retraced their path through the snow, but something had changed. The distance between them had compressed, become charged with an understanding that went beyond words. When Nora stumbled over a hidden root, Grant's hand was there to steady her. When he struggled with a steep section, her voice guided him. "Left foot first, then shift your weight." Back at the cabin, they found Daniel teaching Hannah a complicated game of solitaire, both of them arguing good-naturedly about the rules. The domestic scene was so normal, so peacefully mundane, that Grant felt something in his chest unclench. "This," he thought, "this is what matters. Not empires or accounts or landholdings, but this, people caring for each other in small, essential ways." That evening, as they gathered for supper, Hannah looked between Grant and Nora with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "You two look like you walked to Colorado and back." "Just to the ridge," Nora said, ladling stew into bowls. The food was still thin, portions carefully measured, but no one complained. They'd developed a kind of camaraderie born of shared privation, everyone understanding that surviving together meant accepting less individually. "Saw Thomas's grave," Grant added, and Hannah's expression gentled. "He was a good man," she said. "Dreamer, but good." "All the best men are dreamers," Daniel observed. "It's the ones who dream only for themselves you have to watch." The comment was clearly directed at Grant, but for once he didn't bristle at his father's criticism. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right, Pa. I've been dreaming wrong. Dreaming too small, actually, thinking wealth was the same as success." "And now?" Daniel asked. Grant looked around the cramped cabin, at his mother's gentle face, his father's scarred hands, Nora's quiet strength. "Now I'm learning what success really looks like, and it's nothing like what I thought." Daniel held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, the gesture carrying a weight of approval Grant hadn't realized he needed so desperately. After supper, Nora pulled out her battered Bible and read aloud by firelight. Her voice wrapped around ancient words about valleys and still waters, about mercy following all the days of a person's life. Hannah hummed along, knowing the passages by heart. Daniel closed his eyes, his breathing evening out into something like peace. Grant sat at the table, watching them, and felt the years of armor he'd built around his heart begin to crack. Not breaking, not yet, but fissuring, letting in light he'd deliberately shut out. When Nora closed the Bible, she looked up and found him watching her. For a heartbeat, Their eyes locked, and Grant saw his own cautious hope reflected back at him. Then she smiled, small and private, and the moment passed, but not the feeling behind it. The fourth day brought visitors. They heard the horses first, the jingle of tack, the crunch of hooves in packed snow. Grant tensed immediately, his hand dropping instinctively to where his gun would have been if he'd been wearing it. Through the window, he saw 4 men on horseback, the pastor from Ridge Creek Church and 3 members of the town council, all looking grim and determined. "Trouble," Daniel muttered from his chair. Nora stood slowly, her face draining of color. "They wouldn't. Not now." "Wouldn't what?" Grant asked, but before she could answer, a heavy knock rattled the door. Grant opened it to find Pastor Morris on the threshold, hat in hands, his round face pink with cold and discomfort. Behind him, Councilman Reeves, Patterson, and Thornton sat their horses like judges about to deliver a verdict. "Mr. McAllister," the pastor began, his voice carrying false heartiness. "Heard you were here. Come to check on your parents, naturally. Christian duty and all that." "They're recovering, thank you," Grant said, not moving from the doorway. Something in the men's postures, in the way they wouldn't quite meet his eyes, set off alarm bells. "Yes, well," Pastor Morris cleared his throat. "That's actually what we've come to discuss. It's, somewhat delicate." "Then discuss it," Daniel called from inside. "Cold's getting in." The men dismounted and filed into the cabin, bringing with them an air of righteous discomfort. They removed their hats, but remained standing, arranged in a rough semicircle like a tribunal. Nora had retreated to the far corner, her arms wrapped around herself, chin raised in defiant anticipation of judgment. Pastor Morris cleared his throat again. "Mr. McAllister, Grant, you must understand the town has certain standards, moral standards that we're obligated to uphold." "Get to the point," Grant said, his voice hardening. Reeves stepped forward, a rail-thin man with a face like a hatchet. "It's improper, sir. You staying here, with a widow, unmarried. It's been 4 days now, and people talk." The implication hit Grant like a slap. "You're suggesting—" "We're not suggesting anything," Patterson interrupted, though his smirk said otherwise. "We're simply stating facts. A single woman and a single man living together without chaperone." "His parents are here," Nora cut in, her voice shaking with fury. "Are they insufficient chaperones?" "They're infirm," Thornton said, his tone suggesting this fact made them morally irrelevant. "Barely conscious half the time. It's not proper supervision." "Where were you?" The words exploded from Nora, years of accumulated bitterness detonating. "Where were you when I starved last winter? When I buried my husband with my own hands because no one would help dig the grave? When I nearly froze because I had to choose between firewood and food?" "Mrs. Hayes," Pastor Morris began placatingly. "Don't!" She advanced on them, small but suddenly fierce. "Don't you dare stand in my home, the home I've maintained with no help from anyone, and lecture me about propriety. I saved these people's lives. I fed them from my own mouth. And you come here with your judgments and your whispers as if I'm something shameful?" "No one's saying, sis," Reeves started. "Yes, you are." Nora's voice cracked. "You're saying I'm a scandal, that kindness is suspicious, that a woman can't show basic human decency without it being twisted into something ugly." Grant wanted to speak, to defend her, but the words tangled in his throat. Fear gripped him, not of scandal, but of something deeper. What if they demanded he leave? What if staying meant ruining Nora's already precarious standing in the community? What if the choice came down to protecting his reputation or protecting her? And in that moment of hesitation, that silence when he should have spoken, Grant saw Nora's expression change, saw hope curdle into disappointment, saw her realize he wasn't going to fight for her the way she'd fought for his parents. "Mr. McAllister," Pastor Morris said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "we're not unreasonable men, but the situation must be regularized. Either you leave immediately or you make your arrangement honorable." "Honorable," Grant repeated, the word tasting like ash. They meant marriage. They were demanding he either abandon Nora to the gossip they deliberately stirred up or marry her to silence it. "It's the only Christian solution," the pastor said, as if forcing marriage was somehow virtuous. Grant's throat locked. Terror flooded him, terror of commitment, of losing someone again, of letting another person close enough to destroy him when they inevitably left. Catherine's death had nearly killed him. He'd sworn never to risk that pain again. And now these men were demanding he do exactly that, or else abandon the woman who'd saved his parents' lives. Before he could force words past his paralysis, his father's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. "Enough!" Daniel McAllister had risen from his chair, pale and trembling but upright, one hand braced against the wall for support. Every eye turned to him. "You come into this woman's home," Daniel said, his voice strengthening with anger, "and you dare to question her morality, her decency." He took a shaking step forward. "This woman saved my life. Pulled me from a burning building when she had every reason to let me die. Fed me from her own plate when she was starving. Gave up her bed, her comfort, her privacy, and you repay her with suspicion?" "Mr. McAllister, please," Pastor Morris began. "I'm not finished." Daniel's good hand clenched into a fist. "You preach charity every Sunday. You talk about Good Samaritans and Christian duty. But when a woman actually lives those principles, you punish her for it. You shame her for showing more grace in 4 days than your entire council has shown in 4 years." Silence crashed over the cabin. The councilman shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Daniel's burning gaze. "My son," Daniel continued, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "has been a fool. He's built an empire while forgetting what matters. But he's here now, he's learning, and you will not—" His voice rose again. "You will not use this good woman's kindness as an excuse to spread poison." "The talk is already—" Reeves started. "Then stop it," Hannah said, standing to join her husband. Her voice was softer than Daniel's, but no less fierce. "Use your positions to defend her instead of condemning her. Tell the truth, that she's a saint, not a scandal." Pastor Morris's face had gone from pink to red. "The appearance of impropriety is in your minds, not in our actions," Nora said quietly. She'd regained her composure, though Grant could see the cost in the rigidity of her shoulders. "If you want me to marry to satisfy your gossip, find another bride. But you'll not force me into it, and you'll not shame me for basic human decency." The men looked at each other, clearly not expecting such unified resistance. Thornton, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. "We meant no offense, Mrs. Hayes. We're simply concerned for your reputation." "My reputation," Nora said with brittle calm, "survived my husband's death, poverty, and isolation. It will survive your concern." One by one, the councilmen filed out, muttering about Christian duty and proper appearances. Pastor Morris lingered at the door, his expression caught between contrition and stubbornness. "I truly meant no harm," he said. "But people will talk, Mrs. Hayes. You must know that." "Let them," she said. "I've survived worse than gossip." When the door finally closed behind them, when the sound of retreating horses had faded, the cabin fell into stunned silence. Daniel swayed, and Grant rushed to support him, guiding him back to his chair. "Pa, you shouldn't have—" "Don't," Daniel said, waving him off. "I said what needed saying." Hannah settled beside her husband, taking his hand. They looked at each other with the wordless communication of people who'd weathered decades together, and Grant felt something twist in his chest, envy and loss and longing all tangled together. He turned to Nora, words of apology forming, but she was already moving, gathering her shawl, heading for the door. "I need air," she said, not looking at him. "Nora, just give me a moment. Please." She was gone before he could respond, the door closing behind her with devastating quiet. Grant stood frozen, shame burning through him hotter than any fire. "You going to let her go?" Daniel asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "I don't know what to say." "Start with the truth," Hannah suggested. "Tell her why you're afraid." "She knows why." "Does she?" His mother's gaze was penetrating. "Or does she just know you're afraid? There's a difference, Grant. Fear with explanation is honest. Fear without it is just cowardice." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Grant thought he understood about himself. He grabbed his coat and followed Nora into the cold. He found her at the woodpile, not cutting, but simply standing, staring out at the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold in rows. She didn't turn when he approached. "I'm sorry," Grant said. "For what?" Her voice was flat. "For hesitating? For almost letting them force your hand? For proving that kindness always gets punished in the end? For being afraid." That made her turn. Of what? Marriage? Commitment? Or just me specifically? Grant forced himself to meet her eyes. Of losing someone again. Of letting myself care and then watching them die. Catherine, when she died, it nearly destroyed me. I swore I'd never put myself through that again. "So you built walls instead of a life?" "Yes." The admission hurt, but it also felt like relief, like lancing an infected wound. I built walls and filled the space behind them with money and land and anything that couldn't abandon me. And when my parents needed me, when real people with real needs called out, I didn't hear them, because I'd gotten so good at not hearing anything that might hurt. Nora's expression softened fractionally. "I understand being afraid. I'm terrified every single day, of failing, of starving, of dying alone and unmourned. But I choose to keep living anyway, to keep trying, because the alternative is just existing, and that's not enough." "You're right." "I know I am." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Those men, they weren't wrong about one thing. You staying here has complicated my life, made me a subject of gossip I can't afford. But even knowing that, I'd do it again because it was right, and I'm tired of apologizing for doing right." Grant stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name and couldn't resist. "Then don't apologize, and don't let them shame you. You're the best person I've ever met, Nora Hayes, the truest. And if staying here causes you trouble, then I'll find a way to fix it. Not with money or grand gestures, but with—" He stopped, uncertain how to finish. "With what?" she prompted. "With presence," he said finally. "With showing up. With being the kind of man who deserves to stand beside someone like you instead of hiding behind walls of my own making." Nora studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face for truth or lies. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Then stay. Not because anyone's forcing you, not to protect my reputation or satisfy gossips. Stay because you want to, because you're learning something that matters." "I want to," Grant said. "More than I've wanted anything in years." "Good." She turned back toward the sunset, and after a moment, Grant moved to stand beside her. Not touching, but close. Close enough that he could feel her warmth, hear her breathing, exist in the same space without needing to fill it with words. They stood together as the sun sank behind the mountains and the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. The cold deepened, became biting, but neither of them moved. Because sometimes the most important thing is simply being present. Choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Choosing to feel when numbness would be safer. Finally, Nora spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Stillness isn't weakness, Grant. It's where healing starts." "I'm beginning to understand that." "Good," she said again. Then, surprising him, "Your hand is bleeding." He looked down and saw fresh blood seeping through the bandages from earlier. In his haste to follow her, he'd split open the wounds. "Come on," Nora said, taking his arm. "Let's get you cleaned up before your father delivers another lecture." They walked back to the cabin together, and when they entered, Daniel and Hannah looked up with matching expressions of relief. The fire had burned low, and Grant moved to feed it while Nora gathered fresh bandages. "All settled?" Daniel asked. "For now," Grant replied, settling beside his father while Nora unwrapped his hands. The wounds were worse than he thought, deep and angry. "You need to be more careful," she chided, cleaning them with gentleness that belied her stern tone. "I know." "Do you?" She looked up, and her eyes held a challenge. "Because careful isn't just about physical wounds. It's about guarding what matters. About understanding that some things, once broken, can't be mended with cloth and honey." Grant understood she wasn't talking about his hands anymore. "I'll remember." "See that you do." She finished the bandaging in silence, then moved to prepare supper from their dwindling stores. Grant noticed how little she took for herself, how she made sure Hannah and Daniel ate first. The self-sacrifice was unconscious, automatic, and it made his chest ache. That night, After his parents had retired and Nora had settled onto her pallet by the stove, Grant lay in the lean-to and stared at the darkness. He could hear the wind picking up again, promising another storm. Could hear his father's labored breathing through the wall, his mother's soft snoring. Could hear, when he strained, the sound of Nora shifting on her inadequate bed, probably cold, probably uncomfortable, giving up everything so others could merely survive. And Grant understood, finally, what his father had meant about being better, rather than just richer. Understood that Catherine's death hadn't been a punishment, but a tragedy, and that honoring her memory didn't mean never loving again. It meant living fully, bravely, in defiance of loss. He thought about Nora's hands cleaning his wounds, about her voice reading scripture, about the way she'd faced down the town council with nothing but truth and courage, about how she chose every day to keep living, keep trying, keep being impossibly, stubbornly good. And slowly, tentatively, Grant let himself imagine a future that didn't involve walls, a future where fear wasn't the organizing principle of his life, a future where staying wasn't just about penance, but about possibility. Outside, the wind howled and the stars wheeled overhead, and the winter held them all in its merciless embrace. But inside, something warmer than fire was kindling, something fragile and fierce and alive with promise. Grant closed his eyes and let himself hope. It was terrifying. It was also the most honest thing he'd felt in years. The second storm arrived with the dawn, not with the howling fury of the first, but with a quiet, relentless determination that somehow felt more ominous. Grant woke to silence, the kind of profound stillness that comes when snow falls so thick it muffles even the wind. He pulled on his boots and pushed open the lean-to door to find the world erased, reduced to a wall of white barely 3 feet from his face. Inside the cabin, Nora was already awake, stirring oatmeal over the fire. Her hair hung loose down her back, not yet braided for the day. And in the early light she looked younger, less burdened. She glanced up when he entered, and something passed between them. A recognition of the previous night's conversation, an acknowledgement that things had shifted in ways neither could fully articulate yet. "Morning," she said simply. "Morning." Grant moved to the window, peering out at the obliterated landscape. How long will this one last? Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. She didn't sound particularly concerned, just resigned. "We've got food for another week if we're careful, firewood for longer. And after that? After that we pray for spring." She smiled slightly, stirring the pot. But spring's still months away, so best not to think too far ahead. Daniel emerged from behind the curtain, moving slowly, one hand pressed to his chest. The color in his face was better than yesterday, but Grant noticed the careful way his father eased himself into the chair, the shallow quality of his breathing. "Pa, you all right?" "Fine as a man with half a heart can be." Daniel waved off concern with his remaining hand. "Stop hovering. Makes me feel like I'm dying." "You are dying," Hannah said, appearing behind him with a blanket. "We all are, just at different speeds. That's no excuse for refusing to be cared for." "Woman's got an answer for everything," Daniel muttered, but he let her tuck the blanket around his shoulders without further protest. They ate breakfast in companionable quiet, the oatmeal stretched thin with water and sweetened with the last of Nora's honey. Grant watched his parents together, the small touches, the wordless communication, the way Hannah anticipated Daniel's needs before he voiced them. 50 years of marriage, he calculated. 50 years of choosing each other daily, building a life from accumulated moments of grace and compromise. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked, catching him staring. "That I've wasted a lot of time." "Then stop wasting more," Daniel said bluntly. "Time spent regretting the past is time stolen from fixing the future." Grant nodded slowly, then turned to Nora. "Tell me about the land." "Your land. What made Thomas think it could work?" Nora set down her bowl, surprise flickering across her face. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I need to understand. Everything. What he saw here, what you see. What keeps you fighting for a dream that might be impossible?" She was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "There's a valley about 2 miles north. Thomas found it our first spring here, protected by ridges on 3 sides, south-facing, with a creek that never runs dry. The soil there is rich, not like the rocky hardscrabble near the cabin. He said it was perfect for hay, maybe even wheat if we could clear enough timber. But you never cleared it. Thomas died before we could start, and I couldn't do it alone. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Grant heard the frustration beneath. I'm strong enough for most work, but felling trees, moving boulders, that takes equipment and muscle I don't have. So the valley sits empty while I scratch by on the poor land near the cabin. Grant looked at his father, saw the calculating expression he recognized from his own face when planning a business venture. Could it work? Really? Depends, Daniel said. Good soil, protected location, reliable water, those are the essentials. But land like that usually has a reason nobody's farming it. Hidden problems. Flooding, maybe, or drainage issues. Or just bad luck, Hannah added. Sometimes the land is fine, but the timing's wrong, or the money runs out, or life gets in the way. I want to see it, Grant said abruptly. The valley. Today. Nora laughed, gesturing at the window where snow fell in an impenetrable curtain. In this? When it clears, then. Tomorrow? Next week? Whenever. I want to understand what Thomas saw. She studied him with those searching gray eyes. Why? Because Grant hesitated, trying to put inchoate feelings into words. Because maybe some dreams aren't impossible. Maybe they just need different dreamers, people with different resources or skills or perspectives. You want to fix it, Nora said slowly. Turn Thomas's dream into reality. I want to help you turn it into reality. There's a difference. Daniel made a sound that might have been approval. Hannah smiled into her oatmeal, and Nora, after a long moment, nodded once. All right, when the snow stops, I'll show you. But Grant, she leaned forward, her expression intense. Don't make promises you can't keep. I've had enough disappointment. I'd rather have nothing than false hope. I understand. Do you? She held his gaze. Because hope is dangerous when you're barely surviving. It makes you careless, makes you bet on futures that might never come. I can't afford carelessness. Then I'll be careful with your hope, Grant said quietly. I'll treat it like the precious thing it is. Something shifted in Nora's expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps the willingness to consider trust. She nodded again and stood to clear the breakfast dishes, ending the conversation but not the current of possibility running beneath it. The snow fell all that day and into the night. They passed the hours in small, essential tasks, mending clothes, reading aloud, playing quiet games of cards. Daniel taught Grant a complicated form of solitaire that required strategy and patience, both of which Grant lacked. Hannah and Nora worked together on a quilt, their needles flashing in the firelight, creating beauty from scraps. Grant found himself watching Nora more than he should, the graceful economy of her movements, the way she hummed tunelessly under her breath while working, the small smile that touched her lips when Hannah told stories about Grant's childhood misadventures. He was memorizing her, he realized, cataloging details in case this strange, suspended time ended and real life rushed back in to sweep them apart. You're staring, Daniel observed during a lull in their card game. Grant jerked his attention back to his father. I was thinking. About her. Among other things, Daniel arranged his cards with deliberate care. Your mother likes her. Says she's got steel in her spine but a soft heart. Rare combination. She's remarkable, Grant agreed. Then don't waste her. Daniel's good eye fixed on his son with uncomfortable intensity. Don't come sweeping in with grand gestures and big promises, then disappear back to your empire when things get difficult. Women like Nora, they need reliability more than romance. I'm not planning to disappear. Good, because if you hurt her, your mother will have my hide for not raising you better. And if my heart doesn't kill me first, I'll take a switch to you myself, 32 years old or not. Despite himself, Grant smiled. Understood, Pa. They returned to their game, but Daniel's words lingered. Don't waste her. As if Nora was something precious that could be consumed carelessly, depleted through neglect. As if love was a resource to be stewarded rather than a feeling to be indulged. That night, unable to sleep, Grant lay in the lean-to and thought about stewardship. He'd been a careful steward of his cattle, his land, his financial interests. He tracked every dollar, every acre, every head of livestock with meticulous attention. But he'd been reckless with people, with his parents, his employees, the communities his business touched. He treated human beings like numbers on a ledger, valuable only insofar as they contributed to his bottom line. The realization was nauseating. How many lives had he disrupted without knowing or caring? How many families displaced by land acquisitions he'd never bothered to question? How many small ranchers squeezed out by practices he'd authorized without understanding their human cost? Ephraim's words came back to him. Fires and forced sales, families losing everything while Grant's empire expanded. If that was true, and Grant was increasingly certain it was, then he wasn't just negligent. He was complicit, guilty by willful ignorance. The weight of it pressed on his chest like physical force. Tomorrow, when the snow cleared, he needed to send a telegram to his foreman. Start asking questions he should have asked years ago. Demand accounting not just of money, but of methods. And if he found what he suspected he'd find, corruption, coercion, cruelty conducted in his name, then he'd have to answer for it, publicly, completely. The prospect terrified him. But lying in the dark, listening to Nora's muffled movements through the wall, thinking about the grace she'd shown to strangers when she had nothing to spare, Grant understood that terror was no excuse. Not anymore. The snow finally stopped near dawn of the 6th day. Grant pushed open the lean-to door to find the world transformed yet again, pristine white, broken only by the dark verticals of pine trunks, the air so cold it hurt to breathe, the silence profound and almost holy. He stood on the threshold, breathing in that impossible clean cold, and felt something in him settle. By the time he made it to the cabin, Nora had coffee brewing, real coffee, the last of her precious stores brought out for what she must have decided was an occasion worth celebrating. The smell alone was intoxicating. "Today?" Grant asked, accepting a tin cup from her hands. "Today," she confirmed, "before another storm comes. Dress warm." They set out after breakfast, leaving Hannah to fuss over Daniel's morning medication and Grant's father to complain good-naturedly about being treated like an invalid. The snowshoes helped, but the going was still brutal. Thigh-deep drifts between the trees, hidden obstacles that caught their feet, the constant effort of simply moving forward. Nora led the way, following paths only she could see, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a lightning-split pine, a creek bed visible only as a depression in the snow, a rock formation like a crooked finger pointing skyward. They walked for nearly an hour, Grant's legs burning with effort, before Nora stopped at the top of a small rise. "There," she said simply. Below them spread a valley that took Grant's breath away. Protected by ridges exactly as Nora had described, facing south to catch maximum sunlight, perhaps 50 acres of relatively flat ground, broken only by scattered pines and the silver thread of a creek. Even buried under snow, the land's potential was obvious. The gentle slope that would aid drainage, the natural windbreaks, the perfect orientation for crops. "My God," Grant breathed. Thomas was right. He usually was about land, just wrong about having time to develop it. Nora's voice was carefully neutral, but Grant heard the longing beneath. "Can you see it? Hayfields here, vegetable garden closer to where we'd build. Maybe an orchard on that south-facing slope if the elevation's not too high. Barn in that protected corner. Why not use this land instead of the cabin site? Because I'd need to build everything from scratch. Shelter, fences, storage. That takes money and manpower I don't have. The cabin exists. I can survive there, even if I can't prosper." Grant turned to face her. "What if you had help? Real help, not just talk?" Nora's expression turned wary. "Grant, hear me out, please." He gestured at the valley. "This land could support a real operation. Hay for sale, crops for market. It's exactly the kind of property my company usually acquires, except," he paused, choosing words carefully, "except I don't want to acquire it. I want to help you develop it, as a partner, not an owner. I can't pay you back." "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking—" He stopped, struggling to articulate something he barely understood himself. "I'm asking for a chance to do something right, to build something that helps instead of hurts, to invest in a person and a place instead of just numbers on a ledger." Nora looked at him for a long moment, then back at the valley. "It would take years, enormous effort. There's no guarantee it would work." Most worthwhile things don't come with guarantees. And when you get bored, when your business needs you back in Cheyenne, or some better opportunity comes along, what happens to my dream then? The question was fair, the concern legitimate. Grant thought about his mansion standing empty, about business affairs he'd delegated to men he didn't trust, about an empire built on foundations he'd never properly examined. Then the dream stays yours, he said finally. I'll sign papers making it legal. Any improvements, any investments, they belong to you and your land. I'm not looking for ownership, Nora. I'm looking for purpose. She studied his face, searching for truth or deception. Why? Because since I've been here, living in your lean-to and eating your food, and watching you give everything you have to strangers who needed it, his voice caught. I've remembered something I forgot. That wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve life. That success without purpose is just accumulation. And I'm tired of accumulating. I want to build, really build, something that matters. Nora turned back to the valley, her breath coming in small clouds. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the wind. Thomas died in that valley, trying to move a boulder near the creek so he could redirect water flow. The boulder shifted, crushed his leg. By the time I found him, she stopped, swallowed hard. It took him 3 days to die. 3 days of fever and pain and knowing he was leaving me alone. Nora. So yes, she continued, her voice strengthening. I want to develop this land. I want to turn Thomas's dream into reality, but I won't let it kill anyone else. If we do this, if we really do this, we do it carefully, safely. No rushing, no grand gestures that end in tragedy. Agreed, Grant said immediately. Slow and steady. We take our time, do it right. And you commit. She turned to face him fully, her gray eyes fierce. Not to me romantically, I'm not asking for that. But commit to this project, to seeing it through. Because I can't survive another abandonment, Grant. I don't have the strength. The vulnerability in that admission nearly broke him. Grant wanted to promise her everything, devotion, constancy, a future free from abandonment or loss. But his father's voice echoed in his mind. Don't waste her. Don't make promises you can't keep. I commit, he said simply, to this land, to this project, to being the kind of partner you can depend on. I can't promise never to fail or make mistakes, but I promise to keep showing up, to keep trying, to treat your trust like the precious thing it is. Nora held his gaze, and something in her expression cracked open, not breaking but softening, allowing the possibility of hope to take root. All right, she said. All right, we'll try. They stood together at the top of the rise, looking down at the snow-covered valley that held so much promise and so much pain. The wind picked up, sending spirals of snow dancing across the drifts, and Grant understood that what they were really looking at wasn't land but possibility, the chance to build something good from accumulated grief. Thank you, Nora said quietly. For what? For seeing it, what this could be. She smiled slightly. Thomas would have liked you. You're both dreamers, just different kinds. They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts too large for words. By the time they returned, exhausted and frozen, the sun was high and the temperature had climbed just enough to make the cold bearable rather than brutal. Daniel looked up sharply when they entered, studying Grant's face with paternal intuition. Well? The land's perfect, Grant said, shucking off his snow-crusted coat. Exactly as good as Thomas thought. So you'll help her develop it? If she'll have me as a partner, Daniel looked at Nora, who nodded once. The old man's face split into something approximating a smile. Good. About time you did something worthwhile with that money. Over lunch, rabbit stew stretched with root vegetables and flour dumplings, Grant began outlining plans. Not grand schemes or massive interventions, but careful, measured steps. Clear the timber gradually over summer and fall. Build a small cabin near the creek as a base of operations. Start small with hay and vegetables. Prove the concept before expanding. We'll need equipment, Nora said. Saws, axes, a good plow. Draft horses strong enough for heavy work. And labor, Hannah added. 2 people can't clear 50 acres alone. 3 people, Daniel corrected. I may be half dead, but I'm not useless yet. Pa, you need to rest. I need purpose more than rest. Daniel's voice was firm. I've spent 60 years working land. You think I'm going to sit idle while there's a project like this happening? Grant looked at his father, frail, scarred, his heart damaged by smoke and time, and saw the same fierce determination he'd displayed facing down the town council. And he understood that purpose, not ease, kept people alive. All right, Grant said, but carefully. No heavy lifting. No, I'll supervise the boy, Daniel interrupted, gesturing at Grant. Make sure he doesn't kill himself trying to prove something. I'll supervise both of you, Hannah declared. And Nora will supervise me because someone needs to be sensible. They laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth no fire could provide. For the first time since arriving, Grant felt something shift, not just in his understanding, but in his bones. A sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. That evening, Grant composed a telegram in his mind to his foreman. He'd send it as soon as they could reach town, tomorrow or the next day, weather permitting. The message would be simple. Stop all acquisitions. Audit all purchases from the last 5 years. Full accounting of methods used. And investigate a man named Hiram Bledsoe, whose name Grant had heard whispered in connection with suspicious fires and forced sales. You're brooding, Nora observed, settling beside him with her mending. Thinking. About? About the mess I need to clean up back home. The questions I need to ask. He looked at her. Ephraim mentioned fires, land purchases following disasters. If my company's involved, then you deal with it, Nora said simply. You find the truth, and you fix it. That's all anyone can do. Well, people have been hurt, lost their homes, maybe their livelihoods, because I was too blind or too careless to notice what was being done in my name. So you notice now. You act now. Beating yourself up changes nothing, Grant. Acting differently going forward changes everything. The simplicity of her moral framework was humbling. No elaborate justifications or excuses, just the clean logic of responsibility. Wrong was wrong, regardless of intent, and the only redemption came through different choices. You're right, he said. I usually am. She smiled slightly, her needle flashing as she repaired a tear in what looked like one of his father's shirts. It's both my best quality and my most annoying one. They worked in silence for a while, Nora mending and Grant helping Hannah prepare tomorrow's bread dough. The domestic intimacy of it was strange and comforting, just people doing necessary work together, no performance or pretense required. Later, after his parents had retired and the cabin had settled into night's quiet rhythms, Grant found himself standing at the window beside Nora, both of them staring out at the star-scattered darkness. Are you scared? He asked softly. Of what? Of letting me help. Of trusting that this time things might work. Nora was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer, then, terrified. Every day I convince myself not to hope too much, and every day I feel hope growing anyway. It's exhausting. I'm scared too, Grant admitted, of failing you. Of this becoming another thing I built and then abandoned. Of... He stopped, the truth catching in his throat. Of what? Of how much I've started to care. The admission cost him, but once started, he couldn't stop. About this place. About this project. About... He gestured helplessly, encompassing the cabin, the valley, everything they'd discussed. About me? Nora's voice was carefully neutral. Grant turned to face her. In the darkness, lit only by dying firelight, her features were soft, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed. Yes, he said simply. About you. She held his gaze, and he saw his own fear reflected back. The terror of reaching for connection after loss, of risking the pain that came with caring. For a long moment, they stood balanced on a knife's edge between possibility and retreat. Then Nora reached out and took his hand. Not a romantic gesture exactly, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of shared risk, of two people deciding to be brave together. Then we'll be scared together, she said. And we'll work anyway, build anyway, try anyway. Deal. They stood like that for another moment, hands clasped, before Nora pulled away and moved toward her pallet by the stove. Good night, Grant. Good night, Nora. But before he could leave, her voice stopped him. Grant, thank you for seeing what this land could be, for seeing what I could be. I'm just seeing what's already there, he said. You've been remarkable all along. I'm just finally paying attention. He left before she could respond, retreating to the lean-to and his hay bed. But he carried the warmth of her hand in his, the sound of her voice speaking his name, the fragile hope growing between them like spring grass through snow. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The cold deepened, and somewhere in the darkness, tomorrow waited, full of possibility and peril, promise and uncertainty, everything still to be decided and built and won. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Grant woke to his father's voice calling urgently, the tone sending ice through his veins. He bolted from the lean-to find Daniel collapsed beside his chair, his face gray, breathing in harsh gasps. His heart, Hannah said, her voice shaking but her hands steady as she supported her husband's head. It's worse this time. Nora was already there, her nightdress covered by a shawl, mixing her medicines with practiced speed. But Grant could see the fear in her eyes, the understanding that herbs and hot water might not be enough this time. Grant, Daniel gasped, his good hand reaching out blindly. Come here. Grant knelt beside his father, taking that scarred hand in both of his. I'm here, Pa, right here. Listen to me. Each word was an effort. That banker, Hiram Bledsoe, he's been... Daniel's breath caught, his face contorting with pain. Don't talk, Grant urged. Save your strength. No time. Daniel's grip tightened with surprising force. He's been setting fires, buying land cheap, using your company's name, your money. I heard him bragging about it in town last fall, about how easy it was to, he gasped, to fool the rich man who never asked questions. The words hit Grant like physical blows. He confessed to you? Thought I was too old to matter, too poor to be worth worrying about. Daniel's voice was fading. Our fire, Grant. That was him, testing how far he could push before you'd notice. Fury ignited in Grant's chest, white-hot and purifying. Where is he? Cheyenne office. Another gasp. Your own damn office. Go. Stop him. Make it right. I will, Pa. I swear it. And stay. Daniel's eyes found Grant's, burning with intensity that belied his failing body. Stay with her. With them. Don't build more empires. Build a home. I promise. Good boy. Daniel's grip loosened, his eyes closing. For a terrible moment, Grant thought he'd died. Then Hannah's voice, soft but steady. He's breathing, just exhausted. She looked at Grant with a mother's piercing understanding. But he's right. You need to go. Fix what's broken before it breaks more people. Grant wanted to argue, to stay until his father was stable, but Nora's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Go, she said. Your father's stable for now. But every day that man operates in your name, more people suffer. You need to stop him. I can't leave you. We'll manage. We've been managing. Her voice was firm. This is part of building something right, Grant, tearing down what's wrong first. She was right. They were all right. And sitting here while Bledsoe continued his crimes would make Grant complicit in everything that followed. I'll be back, he said. 1 week? 2 at most. And I'll bring supplies. Medicine. Just bring yourself back, Hannah interrupted. That's all we need. Grant looked around the cabin, at his father's pale face, his mother's worried expression, Nora's steady gray eyes. This was his family now. Not by blood necessarily, but by choice, by shared struggle and growing trust. 1 week, he repeated. Then to Nora. Take care of them. I will. And Grant? She moved closer, her voice dropping. When you face him, this Bledsoe, don't let anger make you reckless. Smart and steady wins. Remember? Smart and steady, he agreed. I'll remember. He packed quickly, taking only essentials. His black stallion was rested, ready for hard travel. As Grant saddled him in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands moved with automatic efficiency while his mind raced through implications and plans. Hiram Bledsoe. He could picture the man now, his chief land agent, hired 3 years ago with impressive credentials and aggressive acquisition strategies. Grant had praised him at board meetings, held him up as an example of results-driven management, and all the while, Bledsoe had been building a criminal empire inside Grant's legitimate one, using Grant's money and name as camouflage. The rage that thought inspired was cold and focused. This wasn't about personal betrayal, it was about justice for families burned out of their homes, for homesteaders pressured into selling, for every person Bledsoe had hurt while Grant looked the other way. Grant was checking his saddle when Nora appeared, carrying a bundle of food wrapped in cloth. "For the journey," she said. "It's not much, but it's perfect. Thank you." They stood in the growing light, the cold biting but the sky lightening to pearl gray. Nora's hair was still loose, her face bare of the careful composure she usually wore. She looked young and vulnerable and impossibly dear. "Be safe," she said. "I will." "And Grant?" She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the gold flecks in her gray eyes. "Come back. Not because you promised, but because you want to." "I want to," he said. "More than I've wanted anything in a very long time." She nodded once, seemingly satisfied. Then, surprising him, she reached up and pressed a brief kiss to his cheek. Nothing romantic, just a gesture of affection and farewell. "Go," she said. "Stop the bad man. Save the day. All that heroic nonsense." He laughed despite the gravity of what lay ahead. "I'll do my best." "I know you will. That's why I trust you." Grant mounted his horse, took one last look at the cabin where he'd learned more in a week than in years of supposed success, and turned his stallion toward the valley and the long road to Cheyenne. Behind him, Nora stood watching until he disappeared into the trees. The smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight up in the still air. The sun crested the ridge, painting everything gold. And in that moment, everything felt balanced between ending and beginning, between what had been and what might yet be built. Grant rode hard through the snow-packed trails, his mind already racing ahead to confrontations and reckonings. But part of him remained in that cabin on Ridge Creek, wrapped in the warmth of Nora's trust and his father's faith and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become someone worth being. The cold bit deep. The trail stretched endlessly ahead, and Grant McAllister, Millionaire Cowboy, rode toward either redemption or ruin, determined to face whatever he found with the truth as his only weapon and the memory of a widow's courage as his only shield. The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days of hard travel through snow that alternated between treacherous ice and knee-deep powder. Grant pushed his stallion as hard as he dared, stopping only when darkness made the trail impossible, or when the horse's heaving sides told him another mile would be cruelty. He slept in his bedroll under pine trees, ate Nora's provisions sparingly, and let the cold keep him alert when exhaustion threatened to drag him from the saddle. Each mile brought clarity. The fury that had ignited when his father spoke Bledsoe's name had crystallized into something harder and more useful, determination tempered by strategy. Nora's words echoed constantly, smart and steady wins. He couldn't storm into his own company and tear it apart with rage. He needed evidence, witnesses, documentation. He needed to dismantle Bledsoe's operation so thoroughly that no court could ignore it. On the second night, camped in a shallow cave that offered minimal shelter, Grant pulled out the small notebook he always carried and began writing. Not business notes this time, but a reckoning. Every land acquisition over the past 3 years. Every property that had come to him at suspiciously low prices. Every homesteader who'd sold right after a disaster. The list grew longer than he wanted to believe, each entry a family's tragedy that he'd profited from without question. By the time he reached Cheyenne late on the third day, his hands were cramped from writing and his resolve was iron. The city rose from the plains like a promise of civilization, gas streetlights, brick buildings, the railroad station belching steam. Grant's mansion stood on the hill overlooking it all, a monument to success he now recognized as hollow. He didn't go home. Instead, he rode directly to the office building that housed McAllister Cattle Company, dismounted at the hitching post, and strode through doors he'd entered 1,000 times as a man certain of his righteousness. Now he entered as something else entirely, a man ready to burn down his own empire if that's what justice required. The night watchman looked up, startled. "Mr. McAllister, sir, we weren't expecting— Is Bledsoe here?" "Mr. Bledsoe?" "No, sir, he left hours ago. Had meetings in town, he said." "Good." Grant moved past him toward the stairs. "Don't disturb me, and don't send word I'm here. Understood?" "Yes, sir, but—" "That's an order, Charlie." The watchman subsided, confusion clear on his weathered face, but Grant was already climbing to the second floor where the executive offices were. His own door was locked, but the key still hung on his watch chain. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it a month ago. Leather chairs, mahogany desk, filing cabinets full of contracts and correspondence. And Bledsoe's office was right next door, connected by an adjoining door. Grant lit the oil lamp on his desk and began searching methodically through his own files first. He needed to understand the scope before confronting anyone. Hours passed as he pulled contracts, compared dates, cross-referenced property records with newspaper accounts of fires and accidents. A pattern emerged, damning and undeniable. Every suspicious acquisition followed the same template. Disaster struck a small ranch. Bledsoe would personally visit within days, offering cash far below market value but attractive to desperate people. The deed would transfer quickly with minimal documentation. And Grant's signature, forged, he now realized, appeared on purchase agreements he'd never actually seen. "Son of a bitch," Grant muttered, staring at his own name scrawled in handwriting that was close but not quite right. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? "Because you wanted to be," a voice answered in his head that sounded uncomfortably like his father's. Because asking questions would have meant accepting responsibility. Near midnight, Grant picked the lock on the adjoining door, a skill learned in his cowboy days that business success had made him forget, and entered Bledsoe's office. It was neater than his own, everything precisely organized. Too organized, perhaps. The mark of a man who needed control. The filing cabinet was locked, but Grant forced it with a letter opener, not caring about the damage. Inside, he found what he was looking for, and worse, a ledger documenting payments to men whose names Grant recognized as trouble. Arsonists, claim jumpers, men who do anything for money. Dates corresponded exactly to fires at properties Bledsoe subsequently acquired. And there, in neat columns, his parents' property in Cold Creek, marked with a date 2 weeks before the fire and a notation, "Final test. If Macier doesn't notice parents' place burning, he notices nothing." Grant's hands shook as he read that line. His parents had been a test. Their near death, a calculated experiment to see if Grant would finally pay attention to the crimes committed in his name. He gathered the ledger, the forged contracts, letters between Bledsoe and his hired criminals, everything that would stand up in court. Then he sat in his own chair and waited for morning, rage and shame warring in his chest. Dawn came gray and cold. Grant heard the building come alive around him, clerks arriving, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of voices. He remained motionless, a predator waiting. Near 9 o'clock, he heard the distinctive sound of Bledsoe's arrival, confident footsteps, cheerful greeting to the secretary, the jingle of keys. The adjoining door opened, and Hiram Bledsoe walked into his office whistling, not yet noticing Grant sitting in the shadows. "Good morning, Hiram," Grant said quietly. Bledsoe spun, his hand going to his chest. "Jesus Christ, Mr. McAllister, you nearly—" He stopped, seeing Grant's expression, his eyes darting to the open filing cabinet, the papers spread across the desk. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Clearly." Grant stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "Sit down, Hiram. We need to talk." "Sir, I don't know what you think you found, but—" "Sit. Down." The command carried such weight that Bledsoe obeyed automatically, sinking into his own chair. Grant remained standing, the papers in his hand. "I've spent the night reading," Grant continued conversationally. "Fascinating stuff. You've been busy. Those files are confidential company. They're evidence of criminal conspiracy, arson, fraud, extortion." Grant's voice remained calm, which seemed to frighten Bledsoe more than shouting would have. "And you did it all using my name, my money, my company." Bledsoe's face had gone pale, but he rallied. "I was expanding operations, using aggressive but legal— Don't insult me by lying now." Grant threw the ledger onto the desk between them. "I've read every page. The payments to known criminals, the documented fires, the forged signatures. He leaned forward. My parents, Hiram. You burned my parents' house to test whether I'd notice. Something flickered in Bledsoe's eyes, not quite guilt, but perhaps recognition that denial was pointless. They were fine. I made sure the widow would. They nearly died. Grant's control slipped, fury bleeding through. My father's heart is damaged from the smoke. My mother still has nightmares. They lost everything they owned because you wanted to prove a point. They were collateral damage, Bledsoe said, and his tone suggested he genuinely believed this justified everything. In business, sometimes, this wasn't business, this was terrorism. Grant straightened, his decision made. You're fired, effective immediately, and I'm turning all of this over to the territorial marshal. Bledsoe's expression shifted, calculation replacing fear. You won't. Do you understand what this will do to your company's reputation? When people learn that McAllister Cattle was built partly on burned-out homesteaders, you'll be ruined. Everything you've built will collapse. Then let it collapse. The words came easier than Grant expected. I'd rather have nothing and be clean than have everything covered in blood. You're bluffing. Try me. Grant gathered the papers. You have until noon to pack your things. If you're still in this building after that, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. The marshal will find you easily enough when I file charges. He turned to leave, but Bledsoe's voice stopped him. No longer smooth and confident, but desperate. You can't prove the signatures are forged. I was careful. It'll be your word against mine. No, Grant said without turning. It'll be my word, plus 20 homesteaders' testimony, plus documented payments to known criminals, plus the fact that you kept records of everything like an arrogant fool who thought he'd never face consequences. He looked back over his shoulder. You're done, Hiram. The only question is whether you run or face justice. Bledsoe stared at him, seeming to see Grant clearly for the first time. You've changed. The old Grant McAllister would have buried this to protect his interests. The old Grant McAllister was a coward who let good people suffer so he could maintain comfortable ignorance. Grant's voice was steady. I'm trying to be different, better. He left without waiting for a response, walking through his company's offices with arms full of damning evidence. Clerks and managers stared as he passed, sensing something monumental was happening, but not understanding what. In his own office, Grant found his secretary, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked for him for 5 years, staring at him with wide eyes. Mr. McAllister? Sir, what's happening? Call an emergency board meeting. Today, 2 o'clock. All senior managers, all board members, mandatory attendance. Sir, that's highly irregular. Do it anyway, Mary. Please. He softened his tone. And after the meeting, you might want to start looking for other employment. Things are going to change significantly around here. She studied him with shrewd intelligence. Good changes or bad changes? Honest changes, which might amount to the same thing. Mary Chen nodded slowly. I'll make the calls. Grant spent the hours until the meeting composing a statement. Not a justification or excuse, but a simple accounting of facts. What had happened, what he'd failed to notice, what he intended to do about it. The words came haltingly at first, then faster as the weight of confession became liberating rather than crushing. By 2 o'clock, the conference room was packed. Board members, senior managers, and several key investors all crowded around the table, confusion and concern evident on every face. Grant stood at the head of the table with his evidence stacked neatly before him, feeling strangely calm. Gentlemen, he began, thank you for coming on short notice. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. It was difficult for me to discover. But it's the truth, and you deserve to know it. He laid it out methodically. Bledsoe's operation, the fires and forced sales, the forged documents, the payments to criminals, his own negligence in failing to ask necessary questions. When he reached the part about his parents, his voice caught briefly, but he pushed through. I've spent years building this company on what I thought was honest work, Grant continued, but I was wrong. At least a third of our recent acquisitions came through criminal means. Properties were stolen from desperate families while I looked the other way. The room erupted. Questions, denials, angry accusations. Grant let them shout until the energy burned itself out, then raised his hand for silence. I know this is shocking. I know some of you will want to minimize it, contain the damage, protect the company, but I won't do that. He met each person's eyes in turn. I'm cooperating fully with law enforcement. Every file, every document, full transparency. And I'm personally compensating every family we wronged. Fair market value for their land plus additional damages. That'll bankrupt us, one board member shouted. Then we'll be bankrupt honestly instead of rich dishonestly. Grant's voice was firm. I'm also offering every affected family the option to buy their land back at the original forced sale price. Some may not want it anymore, but they deserve the choice. The room fell silent. Then one of the older investors, Samuel Price, who'd been with Grant from the beginning, spoke quietly. This will destroy us. You know that. Maybe, Grant acknowledged, or maybe it'll force us to rebuild on a better foundation, but either way, it's the right thing to do. And if we vote against it? Another board member challenged. This is still a corporation. You don't have unilateral authority. Grant smiled without humor. Then I'll resign and do it anyway as a private citizen. But it'll be messier for everyone involved. Better to do this with the company's cooperation. Price studied him for a long moment. What happened to you, Grant? A month ago, you'd never have risked everything like this. A month ago, I thought wealth was the measure of success. Grant thought of Nora standing in her patched dress, feeding his parents from her last supplies. I've learned better. The vote, when it came, was closer than it should have been, but enough board members recognized that cooperating with justice was better than obstructing it, and Grant's proposal passed with a narrow majority. The next days were a blur of activity. Grant met with the territorial marshal, turning over all evidence. Warrants were issued for Bledsoe's arrest. The man had fled Cheyenne, but wouldn't get far. Grant hired investigators to track down every family affected by the fraud, compiled lists of properties, authorized payments that drained his personal accounts to dangerous levels. The newspapers had a field day. Cattle King confesses to fraud, declared one headline. McAllister Empire built on ashes, screamed another. Grant endured the publicity without comment, accepting public shame as part of justice. On the fourth day, he found himself in the cramped office of a lawyer named Margaret Brennan, discussing something he'd never imagined needing, how to divest himself of wealth ethically. You want to do what? Brennan asked, her pen poised over paper. Reduce my holdings to something manageable. Keep one modest ranch for operations, but sell or return everything acquired in the last 3 years. Use the proceeds to compensate victims and invest in community development. Brennan stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Mr. McAllister, that's financial suicide. Maybe, but I can't build something good on a foundation of other people's suffering. He thought of the valley Nora had shown him, of Thomas Hayes dying while trying to make that land prosper. I need to start fresh, clean. This will take months, maybe years. Then we'd better start now. They worked through the evening, drawing up papers, establishing trusts, creating frameworks for restitution. Grant's hand cramped from signing documents, but each signature felt like penance, necessary pain that might eventually lead to healing. Near midnight, as he was leaving Brennan's office, Grant ran into Samuel Price on the street. The old investor looked haggard, aged a decade in 4 days. You're really doing this, Price said. Not a question. I am. It's madness, Grant. Noble madness, maybe, but madness. Probably. Grant buttoned his coat against the cold. But Samuel, I spent years chasing success that meant nothing, building an empire that required me to ignore suffering. I can't do it anymore. What changed? Grant thought of Nora reading scripture by firelight, of Daniel risking his damaged heart to stand up for justice, of Hannah's quiet strength holding them all together. I remembered what matters. People, not property. Integrity, not accumulation. Price shook his head slowly. You're either the biggest fool I've ever met or the bravest man. I can't decide which. Can it be both? Despite everything, Price smiled. I suppose it can. He extended his hand. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. What you're doing, it's not easy. Most men wouldn't have the courage. Grant shook his hand, surprised by how much the approval meant. Thank you, Samuel. What will you do after, when this is all settled? I'm going back to Ridge Creek. There's a valley there that needs developing, and people who need, he paused, searching for the right word, who need someone to show up, to keep showing up. That widow Ephraim mentioned? Nora Hayes, yes. Price's expression gentled. She the one who changed you. She's the one who reminded me who I could be. There's a difference. They parted ways, Price heading to his comfortable home, and Grant to his mansion that had never felt more like a mausoleum. He walked through empty rooms filled with expensive furniture he'd barely used, looked at paintings he'd never really seen, stood in a kitchen that had prepared meals he'd eaten alone. All of it meaningless, all of it wasted. In his bedroom, Grant pulled out writing paper and began a letter. Not to lawyers or business associates, but to Nora. Dear Nora, he wrote, then stopped. How did you explain in words what had happened? How did you convey that confronting his own corruption had felt like dying and being reborn? He started over several times before finally settling on simple truth. Dear Nora, I found him. Bledsoe. Everything my father suspected was true and worse. I've spent 4 days tearing apart my own company, exposing fraud I should have seen years ago. The newspapers are calling me either a martyr or a fool. Probably both are right. But here's what matters. I'm making it right. Every family he hurt will be compensated. Every property stolen will be offered back. It's costing me almost everything I have, and I don't regret a penny. I'll be back within a week. There's still legal work to finish, but I've hired good people to handle it. I want to come home. Strange how quickly that cabin became home. Strange and wonderful. How is my father's heart? Is he following your orders to rest? And you, are you taking care of yourself or just everyone else? I think about the valley constantly, about what we discussed building there. I want to start as soon as the snow melts, not to prove anything or to make grand gestures, but because that land deserves better than abandonment, and you deserve a partner who shows up. Thank you for trusting me to do this right. I'm trying to be worthy of that trust. Yours, Grant. He reread the letter 3 times, then sealed it before he could second-guess the closing. Yours. Was that too much? Not enough? Did Nora even want him to be hers in any meaningful sense? The questions kept him awake long into the night, lying in his too-soft bed, staring at the ceiling and counting the days until he could leave. The week crawled past with agonizing slowness. More meetings with lawyers, depositions for the marshal's office, interviews with newspapers he'd initially avoided but eventually accepted as necessary for public accountability. Grant gave them everything, his failures, his negligence, his determination to make restitution. The public reaction was mixed. Some praised his honesty and commitment to justice. Others called him weak or politically motivated. But Grant found he cared less than he'd expected about public opinion. What mattered was doing right, not being seen as right. On the 8th day, as he was preparing to finally leave Cheyenne, a young couple appeared at his office, the Hoffmans, whose ranch had burned 2 years ago, forcing them to sell and move to town where they'd barely survived. Mr. McAllister, the husband said nervously, hat crushed in his hands. We heard what you're doing. The compensation. The offer to buy back our land. Yes, my lawyer should have contacted you already. He did. That's why we're here. Mrs. Hoffman stepped forward, eyes bright with tears. We never thought. We assumed we'd lost everything forever, that there was no justice for people like us. I'm so sorry for what happened, Grant said quietly. I should have stopped it, should have noticed. But you're noticing now, Hoffman said. You're making it right. His voice broke. That's more than most men would do. They talked for an hour about their plans, about whether they wanted to return to ranching or try something else. Grant listened, really listened, understanding for the first time that business wasn't about numbers on ledgers, but about lives. The dreams people built and the devastation when those dreams were stolen. When they left, Mrs. Hoffman impulsively hugged him. Thank you. Not just for the money, but for caring, for seeing us as people, not just transactions. After they'd gone, Grant sat alone in his office and wept. For the Hoffmans, for his parents, for Nora carrying water through snow to feed strangers, for every person whose suffering had funded his ignorant comfort. The tears were cathartic, washing away years of calculated distance. Finally, on the 9th day, Grant loaded his saddlebags with supplies, medicine for his father, real coffee and sugar and flour for Nora, and turned his horse toward the mountains, toward Ridge Creek and the cabin and people who were waiting, toward home. The ride back took 2 days of hard travel, but Grant barely noticed the cold or the difficulty. His mind was already there, rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd explain. Would Nora be pleased with what he'd done? Would his father approve? Would they understand that tearing down his empire had felt not like loss, but like liberation? He crested the final ridge as the sun was setting on the second day, painting the valley in gold and rose. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, steady, strong, promising warmth. Grant's heart, which had been locked tight for so long, cracked open completely. He was home. Not to the place he'd been born or the mansion he'd built, but to a rough cabin where people had taught him what wealth really meant, where a widow had shown him that grace wasn't about having everything, but about sharing what little you possessed, where his parents had forgiven him for years of negligence and given him the chance to do better. Grant urged his tired horse down the slope, and as he approached the cabin, the door flew open. Nora stood on the threshold, backlit by firelight, and even from a distance he could see her smile. "You came back," she called out. "I promised," he called back. "People break promises." "Not this one. Not to you." He dismounted, and suddenly she was there, not quite running, but moving fast. And without thinking, Grant caught her up in his arms. She laughed, surprised and delighted, and for a moment they just stood there, holding each other while the cold bit deep and the sun sank below the mountains. "Tell me everything," Nora demanded when they finally pulled apart. "Did you find him? Did you stop him?" "I'll tell you everything, but first," Grant looked toward the cabin. "My father?" "Stable. Stronger, actually. Your mother thinks the spring air is helping, though it's barely above freezing. And you? Are you all right?" Nora studied him, her gray eyes seeing more than he'd said. "I'm better now that you're back. I was starting to worry you wouldn't." "I told you I would." "I know, but people—" She stopped, shook her head. "Never mind. Come inside. You look frozen through, and your parents will want to see you." They walked to the cabin together, Grant leading his horse, Nora chattering about the last 9 days, Daniel's slow recovery, Hannah's successful bread baking, the fox she'd seen near the woodpile. Normal things, domestic things, the small accumulations of life that suddenly seemed more precious than any business victory Grant had ever achieved. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of stew. Hannah looked up from her mending and cried out, rushing to embrace him despite her arthritis. Daniel, in his chair by the fire, managed a gruff, "About time you showed up," but his eyes were bright with welcome. They ate together while Grant told his story, finding Bledsoe, the evidence, the confrontation, the board meeting, the legal proceedings. He didn't spare himself, detailing his own failures and the scope of damage done in his name. "And the families?" Daniel asked. "The ones who lost everything?" "Being compensated. We're working through the list systematically. Some want their land back. Others want money to start fresh elsewhere. We're honoring whatever they choose." "At what cost to you?" Hannah's question was gentle but pointed. "Almost everything I have. When it's done, I'll have one small ranch left and enough to live on if I'm careful. The mansion's being sold, most of the livestock, equipment." Grant paused. "Everything built on suffering gets returned or sold to fund restitution." Silence settled over the cabin. Then Daniel spoke, his voice rough with emotion Grant had rarely heard from his father. "Proud of you, boy. Took courage to do what you did." The simple words hit harder than any elaborate praise could have. Grant felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Pa." "So what now?" Nora asked, her tone carefully neutral. "You've dismantled your empire, made your restitution. What comes next?" Grant looked at her across the table, this woman who'd saved his parents and taught him what mattered and trusted him to do the right thing. "I was hoping we could build something, together. That valley you showed me. I want to help you develop it. Not as charity, but as partners. Equal partners." "With what resources?" Nora asked practically. "If you've given everything away..." "I kept enough for equipment, seeds, initial building materials. And I have time now. Hands that can work. Skills I'd forgotten I had. He smiled. Turns out you don't need to be a millionaire to build something worthwhile. Daniel chuckled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Better late than never, Hannah added. Then to Nora, what do you think, dear? Is he worth keeping around? Nora looked at Grant for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, her face transformed with a smile that made his heart stutter. I think he might be, she said softly. I think he just might be. They talked late into the night about plans for the valley, what to plant first, where to build, how to maximize the protected location. It was practical talk, grounded in reality rather than dreams, but filled with possibility nonetheless. When Hannah and Daniel finally retired behind their curtain, Nora and Grant found themselves alone by the dying fire. She was mending one of his shirts. When had she started doing that? And he was sketching rough layouts for a cabin in his notebook. Grant, Nora said quietly, what you did in Cheyenne, destroying your own company to make things right, that was... She paused, searching for words. That was extraordinary. It was necessary. It was both. She set down her mending. Most men would have covered it up, protected their interests. You chose justice over comfort. You would have done the same. Maybe. But I've never had the chance to choose between wealth and integrity. It's easy to be honest when you have nothing to lose. Her eyes found his. You had everything to lose, and you chose right anyway. Grant set aside his notebook and moved to sit beside her. I chose what you would have chosen, what my parents taught me to choose before I forgot. I chose to be someone worthy of... He stopped, suddenly uncertain. Of what? Nora prompted gently. Of you, he said simply. Of your trust, your respect, your... He faltered, terrified and brave at once. Your love, if you're ever willing to give it. Nora's breath caught. In the firelight, her face was luminous, every emotion visible. Grant McAllister, are you... I'm not proposing, he interrupted quickly. Not yet. Not until I've proven I can keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep being the man I promised to become. But I'm asking... He took her hands. I'm asking if you think someday maybe you could care for me the way I'm starting to care for you. Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You impossible man. You ride in here with your grand gestures and your changed life and your earnest questions. Is that a yes or a no? It's a maybe, she said, and laughed at his expression. It's a let's see what happens when spring comes and the real work starts. It's a prove you mean what you say. It's a... She squeezed his hands. It's a, I'm already half in love with you, you fool, but I'm terrified of hoping too much. Grant's heart soared. Half in love is more than I dared hope for. Then you have low expectations, or appropriate ones for a man who's been an idiot most of his life. They sat together by the fire, hands clasped, while outside the wind picked up and snow began to fall again, soft, gentle, covering the world in fresh white. And in that cabin on Ridge Creek, surrounded by people who'd become family, Grant felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. The knowledge that he was finally building something that mattered. Stay close this time, Nora whispered. Don't disappear into business or duty or whatever excuse men use to avoid being present. I'll stay close, Grant promised. Right here. For as long as you'll have me. That might be a very long time. Good, he said. I'm counting on it. The snow melted slowly that year, reluctant to surrender its hold on the mountains. March came with false promises of warmth, then retreated into bitter cold. April arrived tentatively, bringing rain that turned the trails to mud and made every journey an ordeal. But finally, as May painted the valley in green and gold, spring broke across Ridge Creek with the force of a long-held breath released. Grant woke on the first truly warm morning to birdsong and the smell of thawing earth. Through the lean-to wall, he could hear his parents stirring, his mother's voice raised in a cheerful hymn that Daniel's gruff baritone occasionally joined. The sound made him smile. His father's heart had strengthened through the long winter, proving more resilient than anyone had expected. Or perhaps Grant thought as he pulled on his work clothes. It was purpose that strengthened his father more than medicine. Daniel had spent the winter planning their assault on the valley, sketching drainage systems and crop rotations with the focused intensity of a general plotting a campaign. He couldn't do the heavy work himself, but his knowledge had proven invaluable, and his presence kept them all moving forward. Grant emerged into morning light that felt like benediction. The cabin looked different now, expanded with the addition he'd built in late March, giving his parents their own proper room and Nora more space for living. The woodpile was stacked high with logs they'd cut and split together through the long, dark months. Chickens scratched in the yard, a flock Nora had purchased with money from selling eggs in town. Small changes, but they added up to transformation. Inside, Nora was at the stove, her hair caught up in a braid that had become endearingly familiar. She looked up when he entered, and the smile that lit her face still had the power to stop his breath. "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready." "Real coffee or pine needle tea pretending to be coffee?" "Real coffee, thanks to someone who keeps bringing supplies from town." She poured him a cup, their fingers brushing in the exchange. 5 months of living in close quarters, and that small touch still sent electricity up his arm. "We start clearing today," Grant said, settling at the table where Daniel was already eating oatmeal with suspicious enthusiasm. His father had gained back some weight through the winter, and color had returned to his face. "About damn time," Daniel said. "Another week of planning, and I'd have gone mad from inactivity." "You've been invaluable with the planning, love," Hannah soothed, setting fresh bread on the table. "But yes, it's good to finally begin." They'd spent the winter preparing methodically. Grant had sold his mansion in Cheyenne for a fraction of what it was worth, but enough to fund their operation. He'd purchased quality equipment, saws, axes, a plow, draft horses strong enough for heavy work. Most importantly, he'd hired 3 men from town, homesteaders who'd been hurt by Bledsoe's schemes and were grateful for honest work. The crew arrived mid-morning. Jack Morrison and his sons, Tom and Sam, all 3 built like oxen and twice as strong. They'd lost their ranch to fire 2 years ago and had been working odd jobs ever since. When Grant offered them steady employment developing Nora's Valley, they'd accepted with a fervor that suggested they understood this was about more than just wages. "Morning, Mr. McAllister," Jack said, dismounting. "Mrs. Hayes, ready to make some noise?" "More than ready," Nora replied. She'd insisted on being called Mrs. Hayes, despite Grant's gentle suggestions otherwise. "We've been waiting for this since winter set in." They loaded the wagon with equipment and supplies, then made the trek to the valley. The route was easier now, the snow gone, revealing a trail they'd widened through repeated use. When they crested the rise and looked down at Thomas Hayes's dream, Grant heard Nora's sharp intake of breath. The valley was magnificent in spring, grass pushing through last year's dead growth, wildflowers spotting the meadow with purple and gold, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt. The pines on the ridges stood like sentinels, and the south-facing exposure meant the valley floor was already warm, perfect for early planting. "Lord have mercy," Tom Morrison breathed. "That's the prettiest piece of land I've ever seen." "It's perfect," his father agreed. "Mrs. Hayes, your late husband had an eye for potential." Nora's expression was complicated, pride and grief tangled together. Grant moved close enough that their shoulders touched, offering silent support. She leaned into him briefly, then straightened with visible determination. "Then let's honor his vision by making it real," she said. They started with the timber, carefully selecting trees for clearing while leaving enough for windbreaks and future harvest. Grant had learned from his father's teachings that good land management meant thinking in decades, not seasons. They took only what was necessary, and what they took was used completely: timber for building, branches for firewood, bark stripped for tanning. The work was brutal. Even with 6 people rotating shifts, felling trees was exhausting, dangerous labor. Grant learned to read the timber, to understand wind and weight, to make cuts that sent trees falling exactly where intended. His hands, soft from years of signing papers, developed new calluses. His back, accustomed to leather chairs, learned the constant ache of physical labor. And it was glorious. There was something profoundly satisfying about seeing direct results from his effort. Each tree that fell opened more land to sunlight. Each stump removed meant more space for planting. Unlike business deals that existed primarily as numbers on ledgers, this work was tangible, real, impossible to ignore or delegate. Nora worked alongside them, not felling timber, but handling the teams of horses that dragged logs to where they'd be milled. She had a gift with animals, Grant noticed, a calm confidence that made even the most nervous horse settle under her touch. By midday, she'd moved more timber than seemed possible for someone half the size of the Morrison men. "Your wife's something special," Jack commented during a water break, not noticing Grant's startled expression at the word wife. "She's not, we're not," Grant fumbled, then stopped. "How did you explain their relationship? Partners in land development? Friends testing the waters of something deeper? Two damaged people learning to trust again?" Jack just grinned. "Sure, boss, whatever you say." By late afternoon, they'd cleared a section near the creek, perhaps a quarter acre, enough for a test plot. Daniel, who'd ridden out in the wagon and spent the day supervising from a chair they'd brought for him, surveyed the work with satisfaction. "Good start," he pronounced. "Tomorrow, we start on stumps. After that, we plow." "After that, we build," Nora added, pointing to a protected spot near the creek. "Small cabin first, storage second. We need shelter in the valley before we can work here full time." Grant loved how naturally she said "we," as if his presence was assumed, his partnership permanent. They'd spent the winter dancing around definitions, both of them cautious about naming what was growing between them. But moments like this made Grant hope that caution was gradually giving way to certainty. That evening, back at the original cabin, they gathered for supper exhausted and satisfied. Hannah had made a feast, roast chicken with vegetables from their winter stores, fresh bread, even a pie from dried apples. It felt celebratory, marking the official beginning of their venture. "To Thomas Hayes," Daniel said, raising his cup of cider, "may we honor his vision by bringing it to life." "To Thomas," they echoed, and Nora's eyes shimmered with tears that didn't quite fall. Later, when the others had retired, Grant and Nora sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The night air was soft, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called, its voice lonely and beautiful. "I went to his grave today," Nora said quietly, "before we started work, to tell him we were finally beginning." "What did you say?" "That I was sorry it took so long, that I'd found someone to help me finish what he started." She turned to look at Grant. "That I thought he'd approve of you, that I hoped—" She stopped. "Hoped what?" "That wherever he is, he understands, that I'm not betraying his memory by—" She gestured helplessly between them. "By whatever this is becoming." Grant took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Tell me about him. Really tell me. I've heard pieces, but I want to understand who he was." Nora was quiet for a long moment, then began speaking in a voice soft with memory. "Thomas was a dreamer who believed in impossible things. He thought love conquered everything, that hard work always paid off, that the universe bent toward justice." She smiled sadly. "He was wrong about most of it, but God, it was beautiful to believe with him for a while." "You loved him." "I did, completely. Even when I wanted to shake him for his impracticality, I loved him." She squeezed Grant's hand. "But he's been gone nearly 3 years. And grief is exhausting. At some point, you have to choose whether you'll let it consume you or whether you'll learn to carry it while still living. And you chose to live." "I'm choosing," she corrected, "every day. It's not a one-time decision, Grant. Some mornings I wake up and the weight of loss is so heavy I can barely breathe. But then I get up anyway. I feed the chickens and milk the cow and chop wood and do all the small essential tasks that constitute living. And eventually, the weight gets lighter." Grant understood more than she knew. Catherine had been gone 5 years, but he'd only recently started actually grieving instead of just running from the pain. "Does it ever stop hurting?" "I don't think so, but the hurt becomes different, less sharp, more like an old ache you've learned to work around." She turned to face him fully. "Thomas will always be part of my story, but he doesn't have to be the ending. There's room in my heart for what was and what might be." The implied question hung between them. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment, the one he'd been simultaneously rushing toward and fleeing from for months. Time to be brave, or be a coward, forever. Nora Hayes, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I came here a fool chasing redemption. I thought if I could just fix what I'd broken, I could return to my life with a clear conscience. And I don't want that life anymore. I don't want grand gestures or distant management or the kind of success that requires ignoring suffering. He shifted to face her completely, still holding her hand. I want this. Daily work that matters. A community I'm part of instead of separate from. People who challenge me to be better. He paused. You, challenging me to be better. Grant, I'm not proposing yet, he said quickly, seeing alarm flash in her eyes. I know we need more time. You need to be sure I'll keep showing up, keep doing the work. And I need, he swallowed hard, I need to prove to myself that I can build something lasting without destroying it through negligence or fear. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I'm falling in love with you. Probably already have fallen, if I'm honest. And I want to know if you think, someday, when we've proven we can work together and trust together and build something real together, if you think you might want something permanent between us. Nora's eyes were bright with tears now, but she was smiling. You impossible, infuriating man. You stand here asking for my future while claiming not to be proposing. I'm asking if there's hope. If I should keep hoping. There's hope, she whispered. So much hope it terrifies me. Because what if we fail? What if we build all this and then it crumbles? What if you change your mind or I disappoint you or life just... Grant silenced her by pulling her close, wrapping her in his arms. Then we'll fail together and start again. That's what partners do. She buried her face in his chest and he felt her tears soak through his shirt. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd lost everything learning that sometimes the only way forward is together. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of work and rest, progress and setbacks. They cleared more timber, pulled stumps that fought them every inch, turned soil that hadn't been touched in decades. The Morrison men proved invaluable, their strength and experience making possible what Grant and Nora could never have accomplished alone. By mid-June, they'd cleared 3 acres and had broken ground on a small cabin in the valley. Nothing fancy. 1 room with a loft, a stone fireplace, and windows facing south to catch maximum light. But it was solid construction, built to last, with a foundation that went deep enough to withstand Wyoming's brutal winters. Grant and Tom Morrison were raising the roof beams on a blazing afternoon when they heard horses approaching at speed. Grant looked up to see 3 riders cresting the ridge. One he recognized as Ephraim Tate, the others strangers. Something in their posture suggested trouble. Hold up, Grant called down to the others. We've got company. By the time the riders reached them, everyone had stopped working, tension crackling in the air. Ephraim dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave. Grant, Mrs. Hayes, sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble in town. Grant's stomach dropped. What kind of trouble? Bledsoe. He's back. The name sent ice through Grant's veins. Hiram Bledsoe had fled Cheyenne ahead of the marshal's warrant, disappeared so completely that everyone assumed he'd left the territory. Where? Ridge Creek. Showed up 3 days ago with a lawyer and some paperwork claiming he's got legal title to this land. Ephraim gestured at the valley. Says Mrs. Hayes' deed is invalid, that her husband never completed the purchase from the original owner. Nora went pale. That's impossible. Thomas showed me the deed. It was recorded in town. Bledsoe's claiming the recording was flawed. Some technicality about witness signatures. Ephraim looked apologetic. I don't understand the legal mumbo-jumbo, but he's got papers and a judge willing to hear his case. Which judge? Grant demanded. Morrison. From Cheyenne. Grant swore viciously. Judge Thaddeus Morrison was known for 2 things: his willingness to bend legal interpretations for the right price, and his long friendship with men like Bledsoe who operated in gray areas of the law. He can't do this, Nora said, but her voice shook with fear that suggested she knew powerful men could do exactly this. This is my land. Thomas died for this land. When's the hearing? Grant asked. Tomorrow, 10 in the morning. Ephraim's expression was sympathetic. Mrs. Hayes, I'm sorry. I know this is the worst possible timing. After Ephraim left, they held an emergency meeting around the half-finished cabin. Daniel, who'd been supervising from his usual chair, looked like he wanted to murder someone. Hannah held Nora's hand while the younger woman fought tears. The Morrison men stood awkwardly, loyal but helpless. "We fight this," Grant said flatly. "We get the original deed, find witnesses to the purchase, prove Bledsoe's claim is fraudulent." "On what grounds?" Nora asked dully. "He's got a judge in his pocket, and we have— what? A deed I haven't looked at in 3 years? Witnesses who are scattered across the territory or dead? We have truth on our side." Truth doesn't matter when money talks louder. The bitterness in her voice cut Grant to the bone. This is how men like Bledsoe always win. They have resources and connections, and the law bends for them. "Not this time," Daniel growled. "Not if we have anything to say about it." They spent the evening preparing. Nora dug through the old trunk where Thomas had kept important papers, finally producing a deed that looked legitimate, but which Grant's more experienced eye immediately spotted problems with. The witness signatures were barely legible, and one of them appeared to be forged, probably by Thomas himself, desperate to secure land he couldn't quite afford through legal channels. "Oh God," Nora whispered, seeing Grant's expression. "It's not valid, is it?" "I don't know. Maybe." Grant studied the document carefully. The recording might be enough regardless of witness issues. Or it might not. This is exactly the kind of ambiguity a skilled lawyer can exploit. "Then we're finished." Nora's voice was flat with defeat. "Bledsoe wins. He steals my land just like he stole everything else." "No." Grant set down the deed. "No, he doesn't win. Because even if the original purchase was flawed, you've been living here and improving the land for 3 years. That establishes squatters' rights and adverse possession claims. And if Bledsoe wants to argue technicalities, we'll bury him in technicalities. With what lawyer? I can't afford— I can." Grant's voice was firm. "And I know someone in Cheyenne who specializes in land disputes. Margaret Brennan. She helped me with the restitution cases. If anyone can fight Bledsoe's claim, it's her." They worked through the night, compiling evidence of Nora's continuous occupation and improvement of the land, receipts for supplies, testimony from neighbors about her presence, documentation of the work they'd done. By dawn, they had a case that was at least defensible, though far from certain. Grant rode for Cheyenne at first light, pushing his horse hard, praying Margaret Brennan would drop everything to help. The ride took most of the day, and by the time he pounded on her door that evening, he was exhausted, filthy, and desperate. "Grant McAllister," Brennan said, opening her door with eyebrows raised. "You look like hell." "I need your help, tomorrow. Ridge Creek. A man I destroyed is trying to steal land from a widow who doesn't deserve any of this." To her credit, Brennan didn't hesitate. "Give me 20 minutes to pack and start talking. I need to understand the case before we get there." They rode through the night, Grant explaining everything while Brennan asked sharp questions and took notes by lamplight. By the time they reached Ridge Creek at dawn, she'd absorbed enough to be dangerous. The hearing was held in the town's only church, the pews packed with curious locals. Bledsoe sat at the front with his lawyer, a slick man from Denver who radiated expensive competence. Judge Morrison presided from behind the altar, looking like he'd already decided the outcome before hearing a word. Nora sat beside Grant, her face pale but composed. His parents flanked them, Daniel looking fierce despite his weakened state. The Morrison men had come as moral support, standing along the back wall like witnesses to justice or its absence. "All rise," someone called, and the makeshift court came to order. Bledsoe's lawyer went first, laying out a case that was devastatingly effective. The original deed had flaws in execution. The recording was incomplete. The previous owner's signature appeared to have been obtained under duress. Therefore, the land had never legally transferred to Thomas Hayes, and by extension not to his widow. Since the property was technically still owned by the original holder, who'd conveniently sold it to Bledsoe last month, Mrs. Hayes was trespassing on land she never legally owned. Furthermore, the lawyer concluded, Mrs. Hayes has allowed squatters and vagrants to develop this land without permission, causing damage to property she has no legal right to modify. Grant's hands clenched into fists. The characterization of their careful development as damage was obscene. Then it was Margaret Brennan's turn. She stood slowly, gathering her papers with deliberate calm, and when she spoke, her voice carried authority that made even Judge Morrison sit up straighter. Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a technically accurate but fundamentally misleading account of the facts. Yes, there were irregularities in the original deed, but the law recognizes that frontier transactions often lack the formal precision of established regions. What matters is intent, acceptance, and possession. She walked the judge through Wyoming territorial law on adverse possession, citing cases and precedents with the ease of someone who'd memorized the law books. Thomas Hayes had occupied the land believing in good faith he'd purchased it legally. Nora Hayes had continued that occupation, improving the property significantly. By any reasonable interpretation, she'd established clear legal claim regardless of paperwork irregularities. But more importantly, Brennan continued, her voice hardening, Mr. Bledsoe's claim is not merely opportunistic. It's criminal. This court should know that Mr. Bledsoe is wanted in Cheyenne on charges of fraud, arson, and conspiracy. The territorial marshal has active warrants for his arrest. Bledsoe's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection! Character assassination has no place. It's not character assassination if it's documented fact. Brennan produced papers from her case. I have copies of the warrants here. Mr. Bledsoe fled legal proceedings in Cheyenne and is now attempting to use this court to legitimize theft of land he has no actual claim to. Judge Morrison's face had gone red. This is highly irregular. What's irregular, Grant said, standing despite Brennan's warning glance, is a wanted criminal using legal technicalities to steal from a widow while a supposedly impartial judge allows it. Mr. McAllister, Morrison began. No. Grant's voice carried across the church. Everyone here knows what this is. Bledsoe set fires and ruined families to acquire land cheaply. When he couldn't do it through his usual methods, he turned to corrupting legal processes. And if this court allows it, then the law means nothing. The church had gone silent. Every eye was on Grant, and he felt the weight of the moment, not just for Nora, but for every person Bledsoe had hurt, every family whose suffering had funded Grant's own ignorant empire. I was Bledsoe's employer, Grant continued. I enabled his crimes through negligence and willful blindness. But I've spent the last 6 months trying to make that right, compensating victims, cooperating with law enforcement, tearing down what I built on suffering. I won't stand by while he steals again. Hear, hear, someone called from the back, Jack Morrison, supported immediately by murmurs of agreement that rippled through the crowd. Judge Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing between Bledsoe, who'd gone pale, and the increasingly hostile crowd. Whatever arrangement he'd made with Bledsoe clearly hadn't accounted for public opinion turning so decisively. I need to review these warrants, Morrison said finally, and consult with territorial authorities. This hearing is adjourned pending investigation. Your Honor, Bledsoe's lawyer protested. Adjourned! Morrison banged his gavel. And someone get the marshal. If these warrants are valid, Mr. Bledsoe will need to be detained pending transfer to Cheyenne. Chaos erupted. Bledsoe bolted for the door, but Jack Morrison and his sons blocked the exit. 2 local men who served as part-time deputies moved to restrain him, and Bledsoe struggled before finally going still, his face twisted with impotent rage. This isn't over, he snarled at Grant. You think you've won? You've destroyed yourself, your reputation, your company, all of it gone. And for what? For this widow and her worthless piece of land? Grant looked at Nora, who was watching him with eyes bright with tears and something deeper, something like love. He looked at his parents, his father nodding approval, his mother beaming. He looked at the Morrisons and Margaret Brennan and the townspeople who'd stood with them against corruption. Yes, Grant said simply, for exactly that. Bledsoe was led away, still cursing. Judge Morrison retreated hastily, probably to send telegrams explaining why he wouldn't be able to deliver the verdict Bledsoe had paid for. And Grant turned to Nora, who threw herself into his arms hard enough to nearly knock him over. You did it, she gasped against his chest. You actually did it. We did it, he corrected. Together. Margaret Brennan appeared beside them, smiling with satisfaction. The judge will rule in your favor within the week. He has no choice now. If he sides with Bledsoe after those warrants came to light, he'll be investigated for corruption himself. Thank you, Nora said, pulling away from Grant to hug the lawyer. Thank you so much. Thank Grant. He's the one who rode through the night to get me. Brennan's expression turned serious. Though I have to warn you, even with this victory, there will be more challenges. Other claim disputes, water rights issues, survey boundary questions. Frontier land ownership is complicated. Then we'll face those challenges when they come, Grant said. One problem at a time. They celebrated that night at the cabin, the small space packed with people who'd come to witness justice and stayed to share joy. Ephraim brought his family. The Morrisons contributed fresh-killed venison. Other neighbors appeared with bread and preserves, and even a bottle of whiskey someone had been saving for a special occasion. In the midst of the celebration, with fiddle music and laughter filling the air, Grant found himself standing outside with his father. Daniel had tired quickly, as he often did, but his eyes were bright with contentment. "Your mother and I have been talking," Daniel said without preamble, "about staying here, not going back to try rebuilding the old place." "Pa, you don't have to. We want to." Daniel's voice was firm. "This feels like home now. Your mother's happy here, happier than I've seen her in years. And I—" He paused, his scarred hand resting on Grant's shoulder. "I like having my son around. Like seeing you do honest work. Like the man you're becoming." Grant's throat tightened. "Thank you, Pa." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep showing up. Keep being present." Daniel looked back at the cabin where Nora was laughing at something Hannah said. "And marry that girl before she realizes she can do better." "I'm working on it. Work faster. Neither of us is getting any younger." Later, when most of the guests had left and the cabin had settled into quiet exhaustion, Grant walked Nora to the porch. The night was warm, full of cricket song and the smell of pine. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns older than memory. "Nora," Grant said, his heart hammering, "I know I said I wouldn't propose yet, that we needed more time." She turned to face him, moonlight catching in her gray eyes. And I'm terrible at waiting. I'm impatient and impulsive and probably still foolish in ways I haven't discovered yet." He took her hands. "But I'm also more certain of this, of us, than I've been of anything in my life." "Grant, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "Nora Hayes, you saved my parents when you had nothing to spare. You taught me what grace looks like lived out daily. You trusted me when I hadn't earned it and challenged me to be better than I was. You showed me that wealth has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with generosity of spirit." Tears tracked down Nora's cheeks, silver in the moonlight. "I love you," Grant continued, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "Not because you need saving, you don't. Not because I need redemption, though God knows I do. But because you're the bravest, kindest, most remarkable person I've ever met. And spending my life earning your love sounds like the only worthwhile thing I could possibly do." He released one of her hands to pull a simple gold band from his pocket. Nothing fancy, just honest metal that had cost him most of his remaining savings. "I'm asking you to marry me. Not because town gossips demand it or because it's proper, but because I want to build a life with you. Plant crops and raise children and face whatever comes with someone who makes me want to be my best self." Nora was crying freely now, but she was also smiling, that transformation of her whole face that Grant had come to love above all things. "You're doing this all wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "You were supposed to wait until the land was developed, until you'd proven yourself." "I know, but I'm terrible at following plans." "And you're supposed to ask properly, on one knee." Grant immediately dropped to one knee, the porch boards hard beneath him. "Nora Hayes, will you marry me?" She looked down at him, this man who'd ridden into her life as an arrogant millionaire and was leaving as something infinitely better, a partner, a friend, a person who'd learned that loving well meant showing up daily with open hands and an honest heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you impossible man. Yes." Grant surged to his feet and kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks they'd exchanged before. This was promise and passion and years of loneliness ending in the possibility of connection. When they finally pulled apart, Both breathless, Nora was laughing. Your father's going to be insufferable about being right. Let him. He's earned it. They stood wrapped in each other's arms while the night deepened around them and the future spread out like the valley, full of work and possibility, challenges and rewards, everything still to be built and discovered together. The wedding took place on a June morning that dawned clear and perfect. They'd chosen the valley for the ceremony, wanting to marry on the land they'd committed to developing together. Chairs borrowed from town were arranged in a semicircle facing the half-finished cabin. Wildflowers decorated everything, picked that morning by Hannah and a group of neighbor women who'd thrown themselves into preparations with enthusiastic abandon. Pastor Morris performed the ceremony, humbled since the previous winter's disaster, and genuinely moved by the couple before him. Grant wore his best remaining suit, tailored but not ostentatious. Nora wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Hannah had secretly been sewing for months. Simple, but beautiful. Dearly beloved, the pastor began, but Grant barely heard the familiar words. He was focused entirely on Nora, the way morning light caught in her dark hair, the steadiness of her gray eyes, the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When it came time for vows, Grant spoke from the heart rather than tradition. Nora, I promise to show up, every day, in every way I can, to work beside you, to listen when you speak, to challenge you when you're wrong, and celebrate when you're right. I promise to build with you, not for you, to be your partner in all things, to love you not despite your strength, but because of it. Nora's vows were equally direct. Grant, I promise to trust you, even when fear makes me want to withdraw, to believe in the man you're becoming, not just the man you were. I promise to share my life, the grief and the joy, the struggles and the victories, to build something lasting with you, one day at a time. When Pastor Morris pronounced them married, the valley erupted in cheers. Grant kissed his wife, while their assembled friends and family celebrated. Daniel looked like he might weep from joy. Hannah was openly crying. The Morrison men whooped with enthusiasm that echoed off the ridges. The reception lasted all day. Tables loaded with food appeared as if by magic, roasted meats and fresh bread, pies and cakes, preserves and vegetables from everyone's stores. Someone produced a fiddle, then a banjo, then a harmonica, and music filled the valley that had been silent for so long. Grant danced with Nora, then with his mother, then with half the women present, while Nora was claimed by every man in attendance. He watched her laughing as Ephraim Tate spun her in an enthusiastic polka, and felt his heart might burst from happiness. As sunset painted the valley in gold and rose, Grant stood with his father watching Nora teach a group of children some complicated hand-clapping game. She'll be a good mother, Daniel observed. Assuming I'm a good father. You will be. You've learned what matters. Daniel paused, then added gruffly, I'm proud of you, boy. More proud than I know how to say. Grant had to blink back tears. Thank you, Pa, for everything, for forgiving me, for believing I could change. Nothing to forgive. You just got lost for a while. Daniel squeezed his shoulder. Now you're found. Now you're home. That night, after the last guests had departed and the valley had settled into cricket song quiet, Grant and Nora stood together in the doorway of their half-finished cabin. They'd sleep at the old place tonight. The new cabin wasn't ready for habitation yet, but they wanted to mark the moment, to stand together in the space they'd built as a married couple. We did it, Nora said softly. We actually built something real. We're still building, Grant corrected. This is just the beginning. Good. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair, soap and sunshine, and something uniquely Nora. I like beginnings. They're full of possibility. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd lost everything, learning that sometimes the greatest gift is simply the chance to start again. Behind them, the valley stretched out in darkness, waiting for morning. Above them, stars blazed in patterns ancient and constant. And around them, the land they'd chosen hummed with potential. This was what wealth really meant, Grant understood. Not money or property or power, but this, connection and purpose, work that mattered and love that endured, the richness of daily choosing to build something together, the abundance of waking each morning beside someone who made you want to be better than you were. He'd been a millionaire when he arrived at Ridge Creek, measuring success in acres and assets. Now he was simply Grant McAllister, farmer and husband, building a life one careful choice at a time. And he'd never been richer. "Come on," Nora said, taking his hand. "Let's go home." "We are home," Grant said. She smiled. "Then let's go to the other home, the one where your parents are probably waiting to make sure we're properly celebrated." They walked together through the darkness, following a trail they knew by heart now, returning to a cabin that had become family. Behind them, the valley waited patiently for tomorrow, when the real work would continue, when they'd wake before dawn and return to clearing and planting and building, one small victory at a time. The fire that had once destroyed everything had forged something stronger, a home where forgiveness burned warmer than guilt, where a widow's courage had given a millionaire cowboy his heart back, where two broken people had learned that wholeness comes not from avoiding loss, but from choosing love despite it. Grant McAllister had ridden into Ridge Creek searching for his parents and found his soul instead. He'd come as a king and left as a man. He'd arrived with everything and departed with what actually mattered. And as he and Nora climbed the steps to the cabin, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows, where his parents waited with smiles and stories and the gift of simple presence, Grant understood that this, all of this, was what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not empire, not success, not wealth or power or recognition. Just this, just home, just love, built one faithful day at a time. Strong enough to withstand any winter, deep enough to nourish any dream, true enough to last forever. The door opened. They stepped inside, and behind them, the Wyoming night wrapped the valley in darkness that promised morning, in cold that promised spring, in endings that promised beginnings. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. And that, Grant thought as Nora's hand found his in the lamplight, was the greatest gift of all.